we turn our attention to the round city of Baghdad in the winter of 786. In the year 786, a new caliph took his place in Baghdad, which was famously designed as a perfect circle with the palace of the Golden Gate near its center. Harun al-Rashid, not yet 20 years old, inherited an empire whose capital his great-grandfather al-Mansur had founded beside the Tigris roughly 3 decades before. Already among the largest cities on Earth, its 4 gates opened onto roads that stretched toward China, India, the Mediterranean Sea, and the high passes of Central Asia, where merchants traded in silk and spices. The Tigris moves past the eastern edge of the round city in the winter dawn, and you are standing at the water's edge, where mist rises in pale sheets from the surface. The cold air moves across your face with the particular damp chill of December mornings on the alluvial plain, carrying with it the first call to prayer from the great mosque at the center of Al-Mansur city. You watch the fog drift between the reeds along the bank, obscuring for a moment the double ring walls that rise beyond, their baked brick catching the earliest light with a greenish tint that will fade as the sun climbs higher. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes from boats that have traveled through the night, their voices low in the half-darkness as they pass bales of cotton and jars of date syrup from hand to hand. The Tigris has carried these goods from the north, from Mosul and beyond, and will carry others south toward the Persian Gulf. And this is why al-Mansur chose this place when he began building what he named Madinat as-Salam, the city of peace, in 762. The site was chosen partly for strategic reasons, the Caliph's advisors had noted, and partly for trade connections along the Tigris that already moved silks and spices and glazed pottery between continents before the first ring wall was laid. You turn from the river and walk toward the northeast gate, your sandals finding the packed earth of the road that leads inward, and already the dust from the alluvial soil between the walls, fine as powder, has begun to coat the hem of your robe. The historian at-Tabari, writing more than a century later, would describe what you are approaching: a city of double ring walls, 4 gates opening at the cardinal points, with the palace and the great mosque standing near its center. The circular form represented al-Mansur's claim to universal sovereignty, at-Tabari explained, and the Caliph himself had reportedly called Baghdad the navel of the earth, by which he meant that all roads and all rivers and all knowledge would flow toward this point and radiate outward again. The gate of Khorasan rises before you now, its arch of baked brick still warm from yesterday's firing, for the brick kilns have been firing continuously for 5 years during construction, and their smoke has risen in a pale column visible for miles across the flat plain. You pass beneath the vault and enter the measured avenue that runs straight toward the center. A clerk walks ahead of you, his own sandals making the same soft rhythm on packed earth, his arms full of tax records from the provinces that will be stored in the treasury before noon. You follow him through the morning light, and the particular silence of a city built to geometric perfection settles around you, wind moving through empty ceremonial spaces that have not yet accumulated the noise of daily commerce. The clerk turns toward a side corridor, and you continue toward the center, where merchants from Khorasan are even now arriving through the northeast gate with camel loads of lapis and dried fruit. You will see them later, their animals grumbling at the unfamiliar smells of brick dust and river fog, their handlers negotiating prices in the shadow of the ring walls. For now, the avenue opens into the great courtyard, and you pause to observe the greenish tint of glazed brick in early morning light, the same glaze that covers the dome of the Caliph's private chamber, the same that at-Tabari would later describe in his history of this place. Smoke from thousands of cooking fires rises beyond the inner wall, for by 800, Baghdad's population may have reached 1 million, making it perhaps the largest city in the world, though in this winter of 786, the numbers are still swelling toward that total. The smoke rises in a pale column visible for miles across the flat plain, mingling with the mist from the Tigris that moves past the eastern edge of the original settlement. You breathe the air, which carries both the damp chill of Tigris fog in December mornings and the dry warmth of ovens baking flatbread for the construction crews who still labor, though the ring walls are nearly complete. A voice calls from the palace entrance, and you move toward it, passing through vaulted corridors of baked brick where the Caliph's procession will move later in the day, torches smoking in iron brackets that have not yet been lit. The palace and the great mosque stood at the exact center of the circle, and you feel this centrality as a pressure in your chest, the weight of Al-Mansur's ambition made stone and mortar. Similar circular designs existed in Sasanian urban planning. You might recall if you were a scholar of such matters, though the direct influence is debated among those who study the origins of forms. The archaeologist Ernst Hersfeld reconstructed a plan based primarily on at-Tabari's text, as no definitive archaeological remains of the perfectly circular city have been found, and at-Tabari's description may blend historical memory with legendary elements. You emerge into the inner courtyard, where water moves through channels carved by engineers from the Tigris, which ran along the eastern edge of the original settlement. The water catches the light, and you watch it flow toward the palace gardens where date palms have been transplanted at enormous expense, their roots still uncertain in this new soil. The clerk you followed earlier passes again, his sandals on packed earth, his records now delivered, his pace unhurried in the manner of those who serve a caliph who believes his city will stand until the end of time. The morning advances, and you find yourself at the northwest gate, where the road leads toward Damascus and the Mediterranean beyond. A scholar pauses here beside you, watching the same road, his robe marked with the dust from the alluvial soil between the walls, fine as powder, coating every surface. He has come from the library that Al-Mansur is assembling, where texts from Greece and Persia and India are being translated into Arabic, and he too feels the pressure of this center, this navel of the earth that Al-Mansur reportedly called Baghdad, this city of peace that was laid out as a perfect circle with double ring walls described by the historian at-Tabari. The scholar speaks, his voice low, of the city of Ar-Africa, modern Ar-Akka, founded in 772, which may have drawn inspiration from Baghdad's circular plan as its caliph sought to emulate that city's glory. You listen, and the particular silence of a city built to geometric perfection returns, wind moving through empty ceremonial spaces that will not remain empty long. The round city was primarily a government and ceremonial center. You understand now, and residential and commercial quarters expanded beyond the walls even as you stand here, expanding outward like rings in water, like the ripples from the navel of the earth. The sun climbs higher, and the greenish tint of glazed brick fades to ordinary ochre, and you turn back toward the center. The brick kilns fire still, their smoke rising in a pale column visible for miles across the flat plain. For construction continues on the outlying quarters, even as the ring walls near completion. You pass through the gate of Syria, which opened at the northwest cardinal point, and the gate of Khorasan, which opened at the northeast, and you understand how the four gates opened at the cardinal points organized movement through this space. The gate of Syria to the northwest, the gate of Khorasan to the northeast, the gate of Basra to the southeast, and the gate of Kufa to the southwest. Merchants from Khorasan pass you, their camel loads of lapis and dried fruit now deposited, their animals resting in the shade of the inner wall. The dust from the alluvial soil between the walls fine as powder, has coated their robes as it has coated yours, and their laughter echoes in the particular silence of a city built to geometric perfection. You smile, and the expression feels strange on your face, for the weight of this place presses against levity, the seriousness of Al-Mansur's vision made manifest in circle and center and gate. The Caliph's procession moves through vaulted corridors of baked brick, torches smoking in iron brackets that have now been lit though the day is bright, a ceremonial gesture that repeats each morning. You stand aside, and the damp chill of Tigris fog in December mornings returns to your awareness, for the mist still lingers in the lower courts, protected from the sun by the height of the walls. The procession passes, and you fall in behind, not as participant, but as observer, your sandals on packed earth that has been pressed by 10,000 feet before yours. The palace doors open, and the court assembles, and you find a place near the outer edge where you can observe without demanding attention. The original name was Madinat as-Salam, the city of peace, and this name is still associated with the round city that Al-Mansur began building in 762, though the exact completion date is uncertain. The name hangs in the air, and you breathe it in with the smoke from thousands of cooking fires rising beyond the walls, the smoke that has risen in a pale column visible for miles across the flat plain for 5 years of construction and will rise for centuries after. The audience continues, and your attention drifts to the light that enters through high windows, the greenish tint of glazed brick in early morning light now replaced by the golden warmth of midday. You think of the Tigris that moves past the eastern edge of the round city, carrying boats north and south, connecting this center to the edges of the known world. You think of the merchants from Khorasan who arrived through the northeast gate with camel loads of lapis and dried fruit, and of the scholar who paused at the gate of Syria, watching the road that leads toward Damascus and the Mediterranean beyond. The audience ends, and you emerge into the afternoon, where the shadows have begun to lengthen across the measured avenues. The clerk walks again, his sandals on packed earth, his arms now empty, his face turned toward the treasury where he will return tomorrow and tomorrow after that. You follow him for a time, then turn toward the southeast gate, the gate of Basra, where the road leads toward the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean beyond. Evening approaches, and you return toward the center, where the palace and the great mosque stand at the exact center of the circle. The ring walls cast long shadows across the empty space between palace and perimeter, and you walk through these shadows, feeling the temperature drop, watching the greenish tint of glazed brick return as the light shifts toward the red. The particular silence of a city built to geometric perfection deepens, wind moving through empty ceremonial spaces that will soon fill with the sounds of evening prayer and evening commerce and evening rest. You find yourself at the southwest gate, the gate of Kufa, and pause there as the first stars emerge above the double ring walls. The Tigris moves past the eastern edge of the original settlement, and you imagine you can hear it, though the distance is too great, the walls too thick. The damp chill of Tigris fog in December evenings settles into your bones, and you pull your robe closer, feeling the dust from the alluvial soil between the walls, fine as powder, that has become part of the fabric. A last merchant passes through the gate, his day's work complete, his animals stabled, his accounts settled. The brick kilns fire still in the distance, their smoke rising in a pale column visible for miles across the flat plain, though the column is thinner now, less urgent, for the construction that Al-Mansur began in 762 nears its completion in this year of 786. The smoke mingles with the smoke from thousands of cooking fires, and you watch it rise, and your breathing slows to match its pace. The scholar you met at the gate of Syria passes again, his face turned toward the library that waits for him, his robe still marked with the dust from the alluvial soil between the walls. He nods, and you nod in return, and neither speaks, for the particular silence of a city built to geometric perfection has become a shared understanding. Wind moving through empty ceremonial spaces that are not truly empty, but filled with the weight of intention, of Al-Mansur's claim to universal sovereignty made circle and gate and center. You turn back toward the palace, and your steps are slower now, your sandals on packed earth making less certain rhythm. You move toward the center, and the moving is enough, the toward is enough, the center holding everything in balance as the stars emerge above the double ring walls. The greenish tint of glazed brick fades to gray, then to darkness, and you find a place to rest in the outer court, where the damp chill of Tigris fog in December evenings has settled fully into stone and air and skin. The smoke from thousands of cooking fires rises still, though the column is invisible now in darkness, present only as warmth on the face, a scent on the air. You breathe, and the breathing is slow. The brick kilns fire still, their smoke rising somewhere beyond the walls, and the sound of their firing has become indistinguishable from the sound of your own blood moving through the chambers of the heart. Al-Mansur reportedly called Baghdad the navel of the earth, and you feel this now as warmth in the center of the body, as the place where all roads and all rivers and all knowledge flow together and rest. The ring walls cast long shadows that have become complete darkness, and you rest in that darkness, and the resting is the journey now, the center reached not by movement, but by stillness. The historian at-Tabari would describe this city, the city laid out as a perfect circle with double ring walls, the 4 gates at the cardinal points, the palace, and the great mosque at the exact center of the circle. His description may blend historical memory with legendary elements, for no archaeological remains of the perfectly circular city have been found, and the archaeologist Ernst Herzfeld would reconstruct a plan based solely on at-Tabari's text, not on excavation. But you are here, or here is in you, and the distinction matters less with each slow breath. The damp chill of Tigris fog in December evenings has become the temperature of the body itself, neither warm nor cold, but present, simply present, as the Tigris is present, moving past the eastern edge of the original settlement. The smoke from thousands of cooking fires rises in a pale column visible for miles across the flat plain, and you rise with it, or sink with it, the direction of movement lost in the darkness that holds the round city now. The clerk's sandals on packed earth have ceased their rhythm, or perhaps the ceasing is in the hearing, the ear withdrawing from the world as the eye already has. The greenish tint of glazed brick exists now only in memory, or in the memory of memory, the first light of a dawn that has already passed or has not yet come. The wind moves through empty ceremonial spaces, and the moving is a kind of breathing, and your breathing matches it, slower now, slower. The Tigris moves, and the moving is continuous, and you move with it or rest beside it, the distinction gentle now, almost lost. The damp chill of Tigris fog in December evenings, the smoke from thousands of cooking fires rising in a pale column visible for miles across the flat plain, the sound of brick kilns firing continuously for 5 years during construction, all of it present and none of it separate, all of it resting in the center that holds everything. The ring walls stand, or stood, or will stand, the tense of their standing dissolved in the darkness that is not empty but full, full of the particular silence of a city built to geometric perfection, full of wind moving through spaces that are ceremonial and therefore sacred, therefore still. You rest, and the resting is the completion that Al-Mansur sought when he began building Baghdad in 762, completing it in approximately 5 years by 767, the city of peace that was laid out as a perfect circle with double ring walls described by the historian at-Tabari. The completion is not in the walls, but in the resting, not in the geometry, but in the breath that follows the geometry home. The stars above the double-ring walls have shifted, or seem to have shifted, the movement too slow for waking perception. You hear it, or do not hear it, the hearing and not hearing equally gentle, equally present. The smoke from thousands of cooking fires rises, or has risen, or will rise, the column pale against a sky that is dark now, simply dark. The visibility of miles folded into the darkness that is near, that is here, that is the skin and the breath and the slow beating that continues without instruction. The brick kilns fire, or have fired, or will fire, the continuous firing that built the city, that built the circle, that built the center where you rest now, where rest is building still, building peace, building the city of peace that Al-Mansur named Madinat as-Salam when he began building Baghdad in 762. The greenish tint of glazed brick in early morning light waits in the darkness, potential, patient, the first light that will come when the light comes, that has already come in the promise of light that darkness holds. You rest in the promise, in the potential, in the patient center that is the palace and the great mosque at the exact center of the circle, that is the navel of the earth that Al-Mansur reportedly called Baghdad. The Tigris moves, and the moving is rest, and the rest is moving, and the distinction gentle now, almost lost, almost found, almost the same. You are standing in the outer courtyard of a reception hall in Baghdad, where the morning light has not yet penetrated the high-screened windows, and the air carries the coolness of water evaporating from clay channels set into the floors. Servants move along the periphery with palm leaf fans, stirring the heat that gathers beneath the vaulted ceiling, and the particular acoustics of this high-vaulted chamber carry every whisper to unexpected corners. Yahya ibn Khalid, who came from Balkh in Tokharistan, Central Asian territory, newly incorporated into the Islamic world, sits upon a raised cushion at the far end, his silk robes of office heavy with brocade rustling, as he shifts to receive the first petitioner of the day. The Barmakid family had served as viziers and secretaries under the first 5 Abbasid caliphs from 750 onward. And now, in the year 786, their influence has gathered like water in a deep reservoir, still on the surface, but immense in its volume beneath. A merchant from Basra kneels before Yahya ibn Khalid, presenting a complaint concerning disputed customs duties at the port of Ubala, and the sandalwood paste on official documents, still fragrant when unrolled, marks the edges of the petition that Yahya receives with both hands. Ice brought from mountain cellars to cool sherbet in summer audiences rests in a silver basin nearby, sweating upon its wrought stand, and the weight of a seal ring in brass, worn smooth by decades of impressions, presses against Yahya's finger as he considers the merchant's case. The petitioner speaks of ships and tariffs, of dates and indigo, and Yahya listens with the patience of a man who has tutored princes, who has previously served as tutor to Harun before his accession, who understands that governance begins in the willingness to remain motionless while others unburden themselves of their anxieties. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes in the harbors of imagination, in the memory of ports that connect the wealth of the eastern Iranian provinces to the appetites of the imperial capital, and the cold air moves across your face from the motion of those distant fans. The walls of the reception hall display carved stucco in geometric patterns that catch the morning light as it finally enters through the eastern clerestory, and ink made from soot and gall, its sharp smell on the fingers of chancery clerks, lingers in the documents that assistants arrange upon a low table beside Yahya's cushion. The Barmakid family were converts to Islam from a Buddhist background, representing a broader pattern of Persian aristocratic families entering Abbasid service, and this inheritance of learning from the monasteries of Tokharistan manifests in the calm precision with which Yahya ibn Khalid moves from petition to petition, from judgment to judgment, never hastening, never delaying beyond the proper measure of each case. You are standing at the threshold between public and private, where the administration of empire occurs in the space between words, in the pauses between statements, in the slow accumulation of decisions that will outlast any single morning. North of the city, beyond the circular walls that define the round city's perfect geometry, the hunting parks spread across land irrigated by canals that draw from the Tigris. And here Ja'far ibn Yahya rides beside Harun al-Rashid on horses chosen for their steady gait and their capacity to match pace without competitive urgency. Ja'far ibn Yahya became Harun's closest companion and most powerful minister, and the two men move through avenues of cypress and willow, where the afternoon light falls in long rectangles across the groomed paths, discussing the year's tax revenue in the measured tones of men who understand that empire is sustained by numbers rendered in the Barmakid hand. The vaulted chamber's whispered acoustics belong to the morning's work. Here, the sounds are of hooves on packed earth, of water moving through channels invisible beneath the ornamental plantings, of falcons shifting upon their perches in the distance where handlers wait with hooded birds upon their gloved wrists. You are moving through the hunting parks north of the city, and the weight of a seal ring in brass, worn smooth by decades of impressions, has been replaced by the lighter pressure of reins against your palms, by the rhythm of a horse's shoulders rising and falling beneath you. Ja'far speaks of the Egyptian grain harvest, of the Nubian gold caravans, of the silk routes that pass through Ray and Nishapur, and Harun listens with the attention of a man who has learned statecraft from the same tutor, from Yahya ibn Khalid, who previously served as tutor to Harun before his accession. The Barmakids controlled the administrative apparatus of the empire for 16 years, and this control manifested in moments such as these, in the quiet confidence with which Ja'far could report figures from memory, could translate the complexity of provincial administration into the simplicity of companionship between men who have ridden together since youth. Silk robes of office, heavy with brocade, rustling as the wearer kneels, are absent here, replaced by riding clothes of lighter weave, by garments that permit the freedom of movement that hunting requires, that governance sometimes permits. A heron rises from one of the ornamental pools, and the motion draws your attention to the water's surface, where lilies float in patterns that seem arranged by an aesthetic intelligence, where fish move in the depth with the same unhurried purpose that characterizes the Barmakid approach to administration. Ja'far ibn Yahya and his father Yahya ibn Khalid, along with his brother al-Fadl, reached the peak of Barmakid power under Harun al-Rashid, and this peak was not a single moment, but a sustained condition, a plateau of influence that extended across the decades of Harun's reign like the plateau of land that supports these gardens, that separates the city from the wilderness beyond. The cold air moves across your face as the afternoon declines toward evening, and the shadows of the cypress trees lengthen across the path in proportions that seem to illustrate some mathematical principle underlying the beauty of the world, some proportion that the architects of the round city understood and that the Barmakids perpetuated in their governance. In the chancery, a scribe copies a letter to the governor of Egypt in the distinctive Barmakid hand, and the ink made from soot and gall, its sharp smell on the fingers of chancery clerks, rises from the page as the pen moves in controlled strokes across the prepared surface. You are standing in the doorway of the chancery, where the afternoon light enters through high windows of pierced plaster, creating patterns of illumination that shift as the sun moves, that transform the act of writing into a performance of shadow as much as of substance. The sandalwood paste on official documents, still fragrant when unrolled, will seal this letter when it is complete, will mark it as originating from the Barmakid administration, from the family that came from Balkh in Tokharistan, Central Asian territory, newly incorporated into the Islamic world. The scribe does not hurry. The Barmakid hand is distinguished by its clarity, by the absence of ornamental excess, by a legibility that serves the needs of administration across the vast distances of empire. The chancery occupies a wing of the Barmakid palace in Baghdad, and the vaulted chamber's resonant acoustics, while absent here, are replaced by the softer resonance of a space designed for concentration, for the sustained attention that accurate copying requires. Around you, other clerks work at similar tasks, their pens making a collective sound like rainfall on a distant roof, like the movement of water through the irrigation channels that sustain the city, that sustain the gardens, that sustain the life of empire. You are standing in the family library at their Baghdad residence, where manuscripts from Balkh rest in pigeonholes of cedarwood, where Sanskrit grammars among them wait for the attention of translators, sponsored by Yahya ibn Khalid's patronage of learning. The weight of a seal ring in brass, worn smooth by decades of impressions, is replaced here by the weight of knowledge accumulated across generations, by the physical presence of texts that have traveled from monastery to library, from the Buddhist establishments of Tokharistan to the Islamic centers of learning in Iraq. Yahya ibn Khalid sponsored translations from Sanskrit and other languages into Arabic, and this sponsorship continues a pattern established by his family's earlier service, by the intellectual traditions that they brought with them from the East, that they adapted to the requirements of their new faith and their new responsibilities. The library receives light from the north, from windows that never admit direct sunlight, that protect the manuscripts from the damage that illumination can inflict even as they permit the illumination that reading requires. A translator works at a lectern in the corner of the room, moving between a Sanskrit original and an Arabic draft, his murmured renderings barely audible above the silence that collects between the shelves. You are standing among the manuscripts from Balkh, and the cold air moves across your face from the courtyard fountain that plays in the center of the library's surrounding arcade, from the evaporation that cools the interior even in the months when the city outside grows feverish with heat. The translator pauses to sharpen his reed pen, and the sound of the knife against the dried stalk is brief and precise, like the sound of a decision made after long deliberation. The Barmakid case illustrates how converted families from the wealthy eastern Iranian provinces could rise to empire-wide influence, and this illustration extends to the library, to the translation program, to the cultural authority that accompanies and supports political power. Ink made from soot and gall, its sharp smell on the fingers of chancery clerks, has its counterpart here in the different preparation used for manuscripts, in the inks that resist fading, that preserve their darkness across centuries of storage and consultation. The vaulted chamber's public acoustics belong to the face of Barmakid power. This library represents its private foundation, the intellectual capital that sustains the administrative capital, that justifies it, that transforms the exercise of power into the cultivation of civilization. You are standing in the garden of the Barmakid residence as evening approaches, where the light has become the color of dried roses, of old copper, of the desert at the moment when the sun relinquishes its dominance. The family library at their Baghdad residence holds manuscripts from Balkh, Sanskrit grammars among them. And this holding is not merely possession, but relationship, the maintenance of connection between a place of origin and a place of achievement, between the Buddhist monasteries where the Barmakid ancestors studied and the Islamic court where their descendants serve. Servants move through the garden with palm leaf fans. Though the heat of the day has already begun to dissipate, their motion more ceremonial now than functional, a continuation of patterns established in the reception hall, in the hunting parks, in the chancery, in all the spaces where Barmakid influence has established the rhythms of imperial life. Harun al-Rashid visits the Barmakid residence on certain evenings, arriving without the full ceremonial that attends his public appearances, seeking the companionship that has characterized his relationship with Jafar since their youth, since the tutelage of Yahya ibn Khalid, who previously served as tutor to Harun before his accession. You are standing in the shadows of the garden arcade, where the first stars have become visible in the darkening vault above, where the sound of water from the fountain has become more audible as the day's other sounds diminish. Jafar and Harun sit together on a carpet spread beside the fountain, and the vaulted chamber's resonant acoustics are replaced by the more intimate resonance of water falling into water, of voices lowered in conversation that requires no witness but the garden itself. Later Arabic and Persian literary tradition celebrated the Barmakids for exceptional generosity, and this celebration began in the witnessing of evenings such as this, in the memory of a hospitality that made no distinction between Caliph and companion, that treated power as an occasion for grace rather than for domination. You are standing at the edge of their circle, at the periphery of their attention, and the cold air moves across your face as the night deepens, as the temperature drops in the garden more rapidly than in the surrounding streets, protected as it is by walls and vegetation from the retained heat of the city's mass. The years of Barmakid ascendancy accumulated like the pages of the chronicles that the family sponsored, like the translations that multiplied in their library, like the administrative decisions that shaped the lives of subjects from the Atlantic to the Oxus. Yahya ibn Khalid receives petitioners in a reception hall cooled by servants with palm leaf fans, and this receiving continues across seasons, across years, across the decade and more, that the Barmakids maintain their position at the center of Abbasid governance. Jafar and Harun ride together through the hunting parks north of the city, discussing the year's tax revenue, and this riding continues, this discussing continues, the companionship between Caliph and Vizier appearing to deepen rather than to fray, to strengthen rather than to weaken with the passage of time. A scribe in the chancery copies a letter to the governor of Egypt in the distinctive Barmakid hand, and this copying continues, this correspondence continues, the administrative routine persisting with the regularity of astronomical motion, of tidal flow, of all the natural processes that the empire has learned to predict and to incorporate. You are standing in the continuity of these activities, in the apparent permanence of these arrangements, and the cold air moves across your face with the same gentleness that has characterized every descriptive moment, every sensory anchor, every placement of your attention within this historical scene. But continuity contains within itself the possibility of interruption, and apparent permanence can dissolve with the suddenness of ice melting, of a seal impression cracking, of a hand arrested in the middle of its accustomed motion. In the winter of 803, armed men appear at the Barmakid palace gates after evening prayers, and the vaulted chambers' whispered acoustics, which have carried the petitions of decades, now carry the sound of military boots upon marble, of commands issued in tones that permit no questioning, of the mechanical precision with which orders are executed when they originate from the highest authority. You are standing in the garden of the Barmakid residence, where the fountain still plays, where the stars still occupy their accustomed positions, but where the temperature has dropped with the suddenness of political change, with the violence of a transformation that no observer had predicted, that no participant had prepared to receive. The armed men move through the corridors of the palace with the certainty of men who know their destination, who have been instructed with a precision that excludes the possibility of mistake or mercy. In 8-3, Harun suddenly stripped the Barmakids of all offices and imprisoned them. The reasons remain unclear, and this unclarity persists across the centuries, resisting the inquiries of historians, generating the speculations that have become, in themselves, a form of historical production. You are standing at the gates of the Barmakid palace, where the night air carries the sounds of confusion from within, where servants gather in the darkness with the bewildered expressions of those who have witnessed the incomprehensible. Ja'far ibn Yahya was executed. Other family members were imprisoned or exiled, and this execution, this imprisonment, this exile transformed the Barmakids from administrators into victims, from subjects of historical action into objects of historical speculation. The abrupt fall became one of the most discussed political mysteries of the Abbasid period, and this discussion began immediately, in the whispers of the servants who survived the purge, in the letters of officials who sought to understand their own positions in the new arrangement, in the poems that celebrated the fallen family with a nostalgia that preceded their fall by only hours, that transformed their power into memory while the power itself was still warm. The soldiers moved through the library, through the chancery, through all the spaces where Barmakid influence had established its characteristic patterns, and their movement is destructive not in its violence, but in its indifference, in the administrative thoroughness with which they inventory, confiscate, seal. You are standing in the emptying spaces of Barmakid power, where the vaulted chambers' resonant acoustics now carry only the echo of military movement, where the silence that follows the soldiers' departure is more complete than any silence that preceded their arrival. The cold air moves across your face from the open doors, from the gates that have been forced and now stand ajar, admitting the winter night into spaces that had been protected from it, that had maintained their own climate, their own season, their own temporal rhythm independent of the natural world outside. Harun sits alone in the Golden Gate Palace, the seals of office locked in a cedarwood chest, and this solitude is the counterpart of the solitude that now envelops the Barmakids in their various places of imprisonment, of exile, of execution. You are standing in the antechamber of the Caliph's presence, where the distance between ruler and ruled has suddenly expanded, where the mediating presence of Ja'far ibn Yahya, who became Harun's closest companion and most powerful minister, has been removed with a completeness that suggests intention, that suggests calculation, that suggests reasons which remain unclear despite the centuries of speculation that the abrupt fall has generated. The destruction of the Barmakids marked a turn toward more direct caliphal control of government, and this turn manifests in the very posture of Harun's solitude, in the absence of the vizier who would normally attend upon such moments, who would normally mediate between the Caliph and the administrative apparatus that the Barmakids had controlled for 16 years. The cedarwood chest rests upon a table in the inner chamber, and the seals within it represent the physical substance of the authority that has been transferred, that has been reclaimed, that has been concentrated in the person of the Caliph with a suddenness that matches the violence of the Barmakid fall. You are standing at the threshold of this transformation, where the cold air moves across your face from the garden that surrounds the Golden Gate Palace, from the Tigris that flows beyond it, from the dawn that waits to illuminate a city in which the Barmakids no longer govern, no longer receive petitioners, no longer sponsor translations, no longer exist as a political presence. The years that follow 803 will generate explanations, narratives, speculations that attempt to render the abrupt fall comprehensible, that seek in romance, in conspiracy, in theological interpretation, the reasons that contemporary observers could not determine. You are standing in the aftermath, where the cold air moves across your face with the persistence of a historical question that admits no final answer, where the Tigris continues its slow passage through the city that the Barmakids shaped and that has already begun to forget them, where the greenish tint of glazed brick in early morning light waits to be seen, waits to rest the eyes, waits to continue the rest that is already here, already now, already peace. Yet the world does not pause for mystery, and the translation movement that the Barmakids had nourished continues without them, gathering momentum through other hands, other patrons, other rooms where manuscripts change languages and civilizations, lean toward one another across the distances of time. You are standing at the harbor at dawn, where the Tigris moves slowly past mud-brick wharves, and the first boats of the morning are being poled out into the current. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of silk from China, of spices from the Malabar coast, of glazed ceramics from Ray and Nishapur. The cold air moves across your face, carrying the smell of aged parchment from a nearby warehouse where a shipment of books has arrived with the cotton and the indigo. The particular smell of aged parchment, musty and slightly sweet, mingles here with river damp and the smoke of breakfast fires, and you understand that Baghdad's position as a trade hub brought manuscripts as commodities alongside silk and spices, that a scroll of Euclid might travel the same routes as a bale of damask, handled by the same brokers, taxed at the same gates. A bookseller from the Khorasan Gate Market displays scrolls from a recent caravan from Merv, his fingers careful on the cylindrical leather cases, his voice low as he describes the provenance of each to a circle of potential buyers. The dry rustle of papyrus and the heavier crackle of vellum being unrolled fills the temporary stall, and the morning sun catches the pale edges of pages that have crossed deserts and mountains to reach this river port. The translation movement had already begun under Harun and the Barmakids before the house's formal establishment, had already sent roots into the consciousness of an empire that valued knowledge as it valued irrigation and coinage, and you watch these roots extend themselves in the ordinary commerce of a Tuesday morning, in the bargaining gestures of men who cannot read the languages they sell. A Nestorian monk from Nisibis unwraps a Byzantine manuscript of Euclid in a scriptorium near the Tigris, his hands steady from years of handling sacred and secular texts with equal reverence. Syriac-speaking Christian scholars, particularly from the Nestorian tradition, formed the core of early translation activity, and this monks' community has preserved Greek learning through generations of Persian domination and Arab conquest, has kept the flame in places where political power flickered and changed. He spreads the pages across a table of polished poplar, and candle smoke blackening the ceiling testifies to the hours already spent in this room, to the accumulated labor of rendering geometry into a language that once had no word for theorem. The monk's breath is visible in the morning chill, for the heating brazier has not yet been lit, and he murmurs phrases in Syriac as his eyes move across the familiar diagrams, preparing the intermediate version from which an Arabic translation will later be fashioned. Greek works by Aristotle, Euclid, and Galen were translated into Arabic, often via Syriac intermediaries, and this monk's careful Syriac version represents a link in a chain of transmission that stretches back to Alexandria, forward to a world not yet imagined. The works of Hippocrates, Dioscorides, and Ptolemy joined the growing Arabic library through just such hands, through just such mornings of patient preparation, and the monk pauses to warm his fingers before continuing with the 13th proposition. Al-Mamun, still in his father's lifetime, listens to a reading of Aristotle's Metaphysics in the palace, his young face attentive in the lamplight of a winter evening. The Beit al-Hikmah, or House of Wisdom, was founded as an academy in 825 by Al-Mamun, Harun's son and successor, but the prince's interest in such matters has already announced itself in this earlier scene, in the preference he shows for philosophical discussion over the hunting parties and military reviews that occupy his brothers. Al-Mamun's personal interest in philosophy and natural sciences drove institutional support after 813, yet the seeds of that interest are visible here, in the tilt of his head, as the reader reaches the discussion of actuality and potentiality, in the question he poses about the nature of divine intellect. The echo of a reading voice in a vaulted chamber lined with manuscript chests carries a particular quality, a resonance that seems to thicken the air with the weight of accumulated thought, and you are present in this chamber, standing near the carved wooden pillars where shadows pool and disperse. The reader's voice rises and falls in the cadences of formal Arabic, translating as he reads from a Syriac version held in his left hand, and Al-Mamun's fingers trace the edge of a cushion embroidered with the signs of the zodiac. The translation movement represented one of the largest deliberate transfers of knowledge between civilizations in history, and this evening in the palace of Harun al-Rashid contains within it the germ of that vast transfer, the personal curiosity that will become institutional permanence, the private pleasure that will generate salaries and buildings and generations of scholars. The translator Hunayn ibn Ishaq checks his Arabic version of Galen against the Syriac original by lamplight, his pen moving between the two columns with the confidence of a man who has made this journey between languages many times before. Hunayn's reputation has spread through the scholarly circles of Baghdad, through the medical schools and the private libraries where accuracy is prized above eloquence, and his method of translation has become a model for others who follow after. Sour ink in ceramic cups, mixed fresh each morning, stands ready beside his elbow, and the particular smell of aged parchment rises from the Syriac manuscript as he turns each leaf with a spatula of polished bone. The House of Wisdom employed salaried scholars, translators, and copyists, and Hunayn's position among them represents the professionalization of a craft that had once depended on monastic patience or aristocratic patronage alone. His Arabic is precise, almost clinical, avoiding the rhetorical flourishes that some translators employ to demonstrate their own ingenuity, and the lamplight catches the silver threads in his beard as he works through the night, verifying a passage on the treatment of eye diseases that he has rendered once before in a different context. The candle flame gutters in a draught from the window, and he shields it with his hand without looking up from the comparison of two phrases, two conceptions of vision, two civilizations reaching toward one another across the darkness of centuries and the brighter darkness of the Baghdad night. You are walking through the Khorasan Gate market in the hour before noon, when the shadows have shortened and the heat rises from the packed earth in visible waves. The brass astrolabes warming in morning sun on a stone parapet above a bookseller's stall catch your attention with their geometric gleam. The bookseller's voice carries to you across the crowd, describing the condition of a Hippocrates manuscript, the completeness of a Ptolemy, the rarity of a Dioscorides that has come through the mountain passes from a monastery whose name he pronounces with deliberate obscurity. This stall represents the commercial infrastructure of knowledge, the market mechanisms that moved learning from monastery to metropolis, from forgotten language to living tradition. The Barmakid Yahya ibn Khalid had personally sponsored translations from Sanskrit, establishing precedents that outlived his family's political fortune. And you see those precedents honored in the bookseller's careful descriptions, in the premium he places on verified provenance and scholarly authentication. A physician from the nearby hospital district examines a medical treatise, holding the page to the light to assess the quality of the copyist's hand, and the transaction that follows unfolds with the deliberation of men who understand that they are trading in more than paper and ink. Scholars argue the finer points of lunar observation on a rooftop terrace, instruments of brass and wood beside them, their robes stirring in the evening breeze that rises from the river below. Mathematical and astronomical research proceeded alongside literary translation in the House of Wisdom, and these men's conversation represents the other face of the institution, the face that looked upward toward the movements of bodies rather than inward toward the movements of ideas. The brass astrolabes had been replaced now by their more sophisticated cousins, instruments of engraved silver and calibrated wood, and the scholars gesture toward the eastern horizon where the first stars are becoming visible against the darkening blue. The House of Wisdom also functioned as an observatory under later patrons, and the terrace where you stand has been modified for this purpose, its surface marked with meridian lines and sighting notches that record the accumulated observations of years. One scholar adjusts the position of a quadrant, his movements precise, his murmured numbers taken down by an assistant who sits cross-legged in the corner with a wax tablet. The translation movement peaked in the 9th and 10th centuries, outliving its Abbasid founders, and you understand that this evening observation participates in that longer arc, that the star positions recorded tonight will enter manuscripts that will be translated, copied, disputed, extended, will travel to Cordoba and Cairo, and eventually to places beyond the imagination of these men who lean now over their instruments, waiting for the moon to clear the distant palm groves. A copyist finishes the final page of a medical treatise, his ink still wet as the musing calls afternoon prayer, and he sets his pen aside with the particular gesture of a man who has reached the end of a long labor. The copyist's room opens onto a courtyard where a fountain plays in the center of a geometric garden, and the sound of water mingles with the call to prayer from a nearby mosque, creating a moment of suspended activity that recurs 5 times daily in this quarter of scholars. Sour ink in ceramic cups, mixed fresh each morning, has been replenished once already today, and the copyist's fingers show the stains of his trade, a darkness at the tips that no washing fully removes. The particular smell of aged parchment surrounds him in this room, for the treatise he copies is itself a copy, made from a copy, stretching back through generations of careful hands to some original now lost or dispersed. This man's steady production of accurate pages represents the base of the pyramid, the necessary foundation without which the more celebrated achievements of translation and interpretation could not stand. He examines his final line with a critical eye, finds the spacing satisfactory, the formation of letters consistent with the pages that precede it, and he places the sheet with the others to dry in the slanting light that enters through the courtyard doorway. The years between the death of Harun in 809 and the formal establishment of the House of Wisdom in 825 contain the struggles of succession that will place Al-Mamun on the throne and confirm his commitments in directions already anticipated. The explicit model was the older academy of Gundishapur in Persia, and Al-Mamun's knowledge of that institution came through the Persian courtiers who surrounded him, through their memories of a grandfather's service there, through the continued prestige of its medical school, even in decline. You are standing in a corridor of the palace at Merv, where Al-Mamun has established his court during the years of civil war, and the cold air moves across your face from a high window that overlooks the steppe. Around you, attendants arrange shipments of paper from Samarkand, of ink from Khwarazm, of scholars seeking patronage from every corner of the Islamic world, and the particular smell of aged parchment announces the arrival of another consignment of manuscripts from a monastery in the Caucasus. A physician from Gundishapur, elderly now, his Arabic still accented with the Persian of his youth, waits in an antechamber to discuss with the Caliph the organization of a medical school on the model he remembers, and his conversation will contribute to the shape of what emerges in Baghdad after the peace. You are walking through the streets of the new capital after the return from Merv, after the defeat of the rival Caliph, after the consolidation that permits the projects of peace to resume their interrupted development. The men at work in this hall represent the continuation and intensification of that process, the scaling up from individual initiative to institutional program. The Arabic prefix al in words like algebra, alchemy, alcohol, and alkali preserves this period's scientific legacy, and you hear that prefix in the conversation around you, in the titles being discussed, in the very air of a place where new disciplines are being named as they are being formed. A scholar from Harran, his astronomical tables spread across a table near the window, discusses with a colleague from Basra the proper Arabic term for a mathematical concept that has no direct equivalent in the language of the desert, and their negotiation of this term represents the creative labor of the translation movement at its most fundamental, the moment when a civilization finds or forges the vocabulary for ideas it is encountering for the first time. Hunayn ibn Ishaq checks his Arabic version of Galen against the Syriac original by lamplight, and this scene repeats itself in variations across the years of his productive life, in different rooms with different assistants, against the background of different political circumstances. Hunayn's personal output constitutes a significant portion of the transfer of Greek medicine into Arabic, his versions of Galen becoming the standard through which that tradition entered the Islamic world and eventually returned to Europe. The candle smoke blackening the ceiling of a scriptorium where translators work through winter nights has accumulated in layers that darken the plaster in patterns resembling the maps of unknown territories, and Hunayn's eyes, still acute despite his years, move with undiminished precision between the two texts before him. Hunayn's salary at the House of Wisdom, generous by the standards of the time, has permitted him to train a family of translators, his son and nephew, and students forming a network of expertise that extends his influence beyond what any single lifetime could accomplish. The Nestorian monk from Nisibis unwraps a Byzantine manuscript of Euclid in a scriptorium near the Tigris, and the scene recurs in your presence with the quality of a memory that has become present, a past that continues to unfold in the continuous activity of the House of Wisdom. This monk's careful preparation of the Euclidean text participates in the extended peak of translation activity, his Syriac version destined to pass through other hands before reaching its Arabic form, accumulating in the process the corrections and clarifications that successive translators contribute. You are standing in the doorway of the scriptorium, and the cold air moves across your face from the river outside, carrying with it the sounds of commerce and travel and the ordinary life of a city that has become the center of the world in more than political terms. Al-Mamun listens to a reading of Aristotle's Metaphysics in the palace, and this earlier scene persists in the institutional memory of the House of Wisdom as an origin story, a moment of conversion that explains and justifies the later expenditure. The personal narrative of Al-Mamun's philosophical awakening has acquired the force of myth, has been repeated in the biographical dictionaries and the historical compendia as the explanation for what followed. You are present in the later retelling, in the chamber where an older scholar recounts to younger listeners the circumstances of that famous evening, the quality of the lamplight, the subject of the discussion, the question that the young prince posed, and the answer that he received. The particular smell of aged parchment rises from the manuscripts that illustrate the older scholar's account, and the younger listeners handle them with the reverence of men who have found their place in a story larger than themselves. The scholars on the rooftop terrace continue their argument regarding lunar observation, instruments of brass and wood beside them, and this scene too has its earlier echoes, its anticipations in the astronomical interests that Al-Mamun displayed even as a young prince. The terrace has been successively enlarged and equipped, its instruments growing more precise with each generation, its records more extensive, its contribution to the Islamic calendar more authoritative. Mathematical and astronomical research proceeded alongside literary translation, and the men around you embody this combination, their conversation moving easily between the calculation of an ephemeris and the interpretation of an Aristotelian passage on the nature of celestial motion. The brass astrolabes have been joined now by armillary spheres and graduated circles, by instruments whose names derive from the Greek through the Arabic that this institution has forged, and the scholars' robes stir in the breeze as they lean over a table of observations, disputing a measurement made the previous evening. These men's work represents the continuation of the translation movement into its later phases, the establishment of research programs that will persist when the political conditions that enabled them have passed. One scholar proposes a new method of calculation, his finger tracing a line of numerals that have come from India through the same channels of transmission that brought the Greek manuscripts, and his colleagues' skeptical questions probe the method's reliability, its consistency with established practice, its potential for simplification or complication of tasks they perform regularly. You are standing at the edge of the bookseller's display in the Khorasan Gate Market, and the scene recurs in your experience with the persistence of a commercial rhythm that outlasts individual transactions, individual lives, individual political arrangements. The bookseller's stall has become a recognized point of exchange, a place where scholars from the House of Wisdom come to seek materials for translation, where collectors come to fill gaps in their libraries, where the curious come to handle what they cannot afford to purchase. Around you, merchants unload cargoes of more ordinary merchandise, the spices and textiles that have traveled the same routes as the manuscripts now spread before you, and the particular smell of aged parchment mingles with the sharper sense of cinnamon and pepper, creating the composite odor of a city where commerce and learning have become inseparable. You understand that the translation movement, for all its appearance of disinterested scholarship, rested upon this commercial foundation, upon the willingness of traders to transport books as they transported any other valuable commodity, upon the existence of markets where knowledge could be priced and exchanged. The afternoon light slants across the stall, catching the brass astrolabes that have warmed through the day, and the bookseller completes a sale, wrapping a manuscript in oiled cloth with the practiced movements of a man who has performed this gesture 10,000 times, who will perform it 10,000 more before the trade in such objects passes to other cities, other centuries, other hands that will value what he cannot imagine. You are standing at a harbour at dawn, though the harbour here is not of water, but of sand, and the vessels that have arrived are camels whose padded feet have crossed the Taklamakan desert and descended through Afghanistan to reach this place. The Khorasan gate stands before you, its great arch still dark against the brightening sky, and the ammoniac smell of camel urine on packed earth rises from the ground where the caravan has halted for the night. A Khurasanian camel driver moves among his animals with the patience of one who has made this journey many times before, his hands working at the knots of rope that secure bales of silk to the saddles. The silk has travelled from Chang'an over 400 kilometers to the east, passed through the hands of multiple intermediaries, for few merchants ever cover the entire route from one end to the other. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes, and the dry rustle of straw being pulled away from porcelain reveals the particular blue-white sheen of high-grade Chinese ceramic in indirect light. The warehouse doors swing open on leather hinges that have been softened by the damp rot of riverine storage where goods await transshipment. Inside, the space stretches back into shadow, and the camel driver calls softly to his companions as they lift each bale between them. The silk from Chang'an weighs less than you might expect, having lost moisture to the desert air through which it passed. The Taklamakan has left its mark in the form of fine dust that powders the wrappings, and the descent through Afghanistan has added the faint aroma of the high pastures where the caravan rested and grazed its animals. You are standing at the threshold of this warehouse, and around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes with the methodical rhythm of those who know that the day will bring heat enough to exhaust any labor begun too late. The cold air moves across your face, carrying with it the first suggestion of the day's warmth to come. A Chinese porcelain bowl, wrapped in straw, changes hands for a weight of silver dinars, and the money changer scales balance with a precision that speaks of long practice. The bowl has travelled from Chang'an, over 400 kilometers to the east, passed through the Pamir Mountains, where the cold can crack glaze as surely as any blow, and survived the hands of merchants in Samarkand and Merv who each took their portion of its value as it moved westward. The particular blue-white sheen of high-grade Chinese porcelain in indirect light catches the early sun that now enters through the warehouse doorway, and you find yourself drawn to examine the painted decoration, the faint tracery of a landscape that seems to recede into the curved surface. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of more ordinary merchandise, the spices and textiles that fill the greater part of any caravan's burden. The silver dinars that purchase this bowl are themselves a currency that has travelled, for the Abbasid dinar became a standard across the trading world, accepted in markets from Cordoba to the edges of Central Asia. The Dhow captain from Suraf has navigated the last stretch of the Tigris by star and riverbank memory, his vessel low in the water with the weight of pepper, teak, and aromatics, brought up the Persian Gulf from Indian Ocean ports. The Tigris itself carries riverboats north and south, connecting to a network of canals that spreads through the city like the veins of a leaf, and the captain's knowledge of these waterways has been accumulated over 20 years of passages. You are standing at the quayside near the Basra gate, where the categories of merchandise differ from those handled at the Khorasan gate, and the damp rot of riverine storage mingles here with the sharper sense of the cargoes being moved. The Indian Ocean dhows that brought these cargoes up the Persian Gulf to Basra, then overland to Baghdad, have also carried news of distant markets, of prices and political changes that will shape the decisions of merchants in the days to come. The pepper dust catches in your throat, making your eyes water, and you step back from the sacks being emptied onto the quay. The annual pepper harvest has arrived, and the spice market will fill with this cargo in the hours ahead, the porters sweating in the humid air of late summer as they work in conditions that seem designed to extract every drop of moisture from a man's body. The Tigris flows past, its surface catching the light in shifting patterns, and the network of canals that branches from it carries water into parts of the city that the river itself cannot reach. Baghdad's location was chosen partly for these converging trade advantages, the point at which river routes and desert caravans and sea passages might all be joined into a single system of exchange. You are standing at the edge of this commerce, and the cold air that moved across your face at dawn has given way to something heavier, laden with the smells of the cargoes around you. The ammoniac smell of camel urine on packed earth after a caravan's arrival still lingers in the distance, a reminder of the other gate where the morning's work began. A Viking trader displays hacked silver fragments on a cloth spread across a stone counter, and the Baghdad money changer tests each piece on a touchstone, drawing the metal across the dark surface to read its composition in the streak it leaves behind. The Viking dirhams from Scandinavian silver mines have been found across Abbasid territory, evidence of northern trade connections that seem at first improbable, until one considers the long chains of transaction that can move goods and metal across such distances. The silver coins ring on the stone counter, each tested for purity by its sound, and the money changer's ear has been trained to distinguish the true note from the false. You are standing at the edge of this exchange, and around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of more ordinary merchandise, the spices and textiles that form the steady current of the city's commerce. The hacked silver fragments catch the light with a dull gleam, their irregular shapes speaking of a process of division that has broken larger pieces into portions suitable for smaller transactions. The money changer's touchstone bears the accumulated marks of years of such testing, a record of trust, verified and occasionally withheld. The saffron released from warmed bales stains the fingers of the merchant who examines it, and the air around him takes on the color and scent of this most precious of dyes. The spice market fills with the annual pepper harvest, and the porters sweating in the humid air of late summer move through the narrow lanes with sacks balanced on shoulders that have grown hard with years of such labor. The pepper dust catching in the throat, making eyes water in the spice merchant's quarter, becomes a constant condition of this place, and those who work here have learned to breathe shallowly when the wind carries the ground powder through the air. You are standing at the corner where the saffron merchant has set out his display, and the particular blue-white sheen of high-grade Chinese porcelain in indirect light can still be seen in the booth across the narrow way, where a dealer from the Koras and Gate warehouse has brought his finest pieces for retail sale. The letter of credit written in Basra is honored at a banking house near the Great Mosque, the document passing from hand to hand with the gravity of something that represents value without itself containing it. The banking house occupies a corner where the street widens slightly, and the silver coins ring on a stone counter within, each tested for purity by its sound as transactions are settled in metal, despite the paper that has facilitated them. You are standing in the doorway of this establishment, and the coolness of its interior offers relief from the warmth that is built in the streets outside. The tax revenue from trade formed a substantial portion of caliphal income, and the records kept in this house contribute to the accounts from which that revenue is drawn, the percentage due on each transaction marked in ink that will later be compiled into reports for the administration. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes, though here the cargoes are records, the documents of obligation and payment that make possible the movement of actual goods across such distances as separate Baghdad from Basra, from Chang'an, from the Scandinavian silver mines that supplied the Viking dirhams found across Abbasid territory. The Dhow captain from Suraf has found his agent in the banking house, and the two men examine the manifest of his cargo, the pepper, teak, and aromatics that came up the Persian Gulf to Basra, then overland to Baghdad by the route that the Tigris and its network of canals have made possible. The damp rot of riverine storage has already begun to affect a portion of the teak, and the captain accepts a reduction in his payment with the resignation of one who has learned that not every voyage yields its full expectation. You are standing at the edge of this negotiation, and the cold air moves across your face from the courtyard that opens behind the banking house, a fountain playing there whose sound has accompanied countless such discussions. The Abbasid dinar became a standard across the trading world, and the captain will carry his payment in this form, the coins tested on the same touchstone that the Viking traders' silver fragments have already marked. The Khurasanian camel driver has completed his business at the Khorasan Gate warehouse and makes his way toward the quarter where travelers from his region gather, his animals stabled now and fed, their burdens transferred to other hands. The silk from Chang'an will be cut and sold in portions, some remaining in Baghdad to clothe the wealthy, some continuing by other routes to Mediterranean ports, from which goods continued by sea to European markets. The goods traveled in stages through multiple intermediaries, and few merchants covered the entire route, yet the system as a whole functioned with a coherence that moved commodities across distances that would have seemed impossible to traverse in a single lifetime. You are standing at the entrance to the caravanserai, where the camel driver will rest, and the ammoniac smell of camel urine on packed earth after a caravan's arrival mingles here with the cooking smells of the kitchen that serves these guests. The Chinese porcelain bowl, wrapped in straw, has found its purchaser, a household agent buying for a family whose wealth derives from landholdings outside the city, but whose tastes have been shaped by the cosmopolitan culture that trade has created. You are standing in the narrow street outside the dealer's booth, and the saffron released from warmed bales nearby stains the fingers of a passing servant who has been sent to purchase a small quantity for her mistress's kitchen. The city consumed enormous quantities of imported food, textiles, and building materials to sustain its million inhabitants, and the movement of goods through its markets represents not luxury alone, but necessity, the feeding and clothing and sheltering of a population that has grown beyond what the immediate surroundings could support. The Viking trader has gathered his tested silver and moves toward the quarter where northern visitors find accommodation, his business concluded for the day. The hacked silver fragments have been accepted, their value verified by the money changer's touchstone, and the Viking dirhams from Scandinavian silver mines that have been found across Abbasid territory represent a trade connection that this transaction continues, however modestly. You are standing at the corner where his path crosses that of the Dhow captain from Suraf, and for a moment these two men of such different origins occupy the same space, though they do not speak, their languages having no common ground. The Tigris flows past, carrying river boats north and south, and the network of canals that branches from it moves goods into parts of the city that neither of these men will visit during his stay. The porters sweating in the humid air of late summer have found shade where they can rest, their labor interrupted by the necessity of preserving their strength for the days to come. You are standing at the edge of the spice market, and the damp rot of riverine storage mingles here with the pungency of the pepper itself. The teak and aromatics that came with it already moved to other parts of the market, where their own purchasers wait. The letter of credit written in Basra has been recorded in the banking house's ledgers. The transaction it facilitated, now part of the accumulated documentation from which the tax revenue from trade will be calculated. The silver coins ring on the stone counter still, as other business continues, each tested for purity by its sound in a ritual that has become automatic for those who perform it. You are standing in the courtyard behind the banking house, and the fountain's sound has grown more prominent as the day's other noises diminish, the water catching the light in falling arcs that scatter it into momentary brilliance. Chinese craftsmen were recorded working in Baghdad by the 9th century, and their presence in this city testifies to the distances that trade could collapse, the skills of Chang'an made available in a place separated from that origin by the 400 kilometers of the Silk Road network that connected Baghdad to the east. The quays at the Khorasan Gate and Basra Gate handled separate categories of merchandise, and the distinction between them has shaped the geography of the city's commerce. The silk and porcelain from the east entering by one route, the spices and wood from the south by another. The camel driver from Khorasan and the dhow captain from Suraf will never meet, their worlds touching only in the banking houses and warehouses where the system as a whole is coordinated. You are standing at a point between these two zones, and the particular blue-white sheen of high-grade Chinese porcelain in indirect light can still be seen in a booth where the day's last transactions are being attempted, the dealer reluctant to close without a final sale. The saffron released from warmed bales has permeated this quarter, staining fingers and air alike with its distinctive color and scent, and those who pass through carry traces of it on their clothing. The Viking trader's silver, the dhow captain's payment, the purchase price of the Chinese porcelain bowl wrapped in straw, all have been or will be translated into this common measure, the dinar's gold content verified by the same touchstone that tests lesser metals. You are standing at the edge of the market as the light fails, and the ammoniac smell of camel urine on packed earth after a caravan's arrival has faded, replaced by the cooking fires of the evening meal, the smoke rising in thin columns that catch the last visibility. The Tigris and its network of canals, the desert routes through the Taklamakan and across the Pamir Mountains, the sea passages of the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf, all converged on this place, drawn by the concentration of purchasing power that 1 million inhabitants represented. You are standing at the edge of the river now, and the dark water moves past with a sound that has accompanied every stage of this day's observation. The river boats that carries north and south visible only as shapes against the lesser darkness of the sky. The damp rot of riverine storage has its nighttime smell, different from the daytime version, something released by cooling that heat had held in suspension. Around you, the last merchants are unloading their cargoes, the final transfers of the day being made in haste before full darkness prevents further work. The Viking dirhams from Scandinavian silver mines that have been found across Abbasid territory, evidence of northern trade connections, rest now in the trader's purse, their irregular shapes pressing against each other with a faint metallic sound. The route that brought them here passed through lands that the Caliph's authority never reached, carried by intermediaries whose names will not be recorded, yet the presence of these coins in this place attests to the reality of the connection. You are standing at the door of the caravanserai where the northern trader will sleep, and the cold air moves across your face with a sharpness that suggests the desert beyond the city's walls, the temperature drop that comes with night in this season. Around you, the city prepares for night, the gates that have admitted the day's commerce now preparing to close, the Khorasan Gate and Basra Gate that handled separate categories of merchandise, each drawing their barriers against the darkness outside. Chinese craftsmen were reportedly working in Baghdad by the 9th century, and their presence here, like that of the Viking trader, like the dhow captain from Suraf, like the Khurasanian camel driver with his bales of silk from Chang'an, speaks to a city that traded with many peoples, that found advantage in its position at the convergence of major routes. You are standing at the center of this convergence, and the silver coins ring on a stone counter somewhere in the darkness, each tested for purity by its sound, the last transaction of the day being concluded before the money changer closes his booth. The saffron released from warmed bales has permeated the quarter where it was sold, staining fingers and air alike with a persistence that will survive until morning's washing. Around you, the city breathes in the rhythm it has maintained through centuries, the intake of goods from every direction, the transformation of those goods through exchange and manufacture, the exhalation of value back along the routes that brought them. The Silk Road network connected Baghdad to Chang'an over 400 kilometers to the east, and in the darkness you can almost feel the extension of that connection, the thread of commerce that stretches across the Taklamakan Desert, over the Pamir Mountains, through Central Asia, to reach the distant capital from which the porcelain and the silk may have come. You are standing at the edge of sleep now, as the city stands at the edge of night, and the sounds that reach you have grown indistinct, the fountain and the river and the distant voice of the caller blending into a continuous murmur that neither demands nor refuses attention. The cold air moves across your face with the gentleness of a hand, and the darkness is complete, the stars that guided the Dhow captain from Suraf now visible above the walls that have enclosed this day's commerce. Around you, the city rests, its million inhabitants sustained by the enormous quantities of imported food, textiles, and building materials that the markets have distributed, its tax revenue from trade already being counted in the administration buildings that will begin their work again with the dawn. The darkness is complete, the stars that guided the Dhow captain from Suraf now visible above the walls that have enclosed this day's commerce. You are standing now in a different city, in a different season, though the same stars turn overhead. The palace complex at Aachen rises before you in the winter dark of 802, 4 years after Charlemagne was crowned emperor in Rome, 4 years before Harun's gift would arrive at these gates. Snow has fallen during the night, and the fresh covering softens the angles of the chapel and the assembly halls where the Frankish king has established his capital. Your breath mingles with the wood smoke that drifts from 1,000 chimneys across the settlement, the particular Frankish winter smell of resin and frost that would be alien to creatures of the Tigris floodplain. The cold air moves across your face with a steady pressure that carries no moisture, no memory of the warm seas that touch the distant coasts of the Mediterranean. Around you, the palace stirs before full light. Servants move between buildings with hooded lanterns, their footsteps muffled by the snow that has accumulated in the courtyard where, in years to come, an elephant named a Balabas will stand with his breath visible in cold morning air. The Frankish kingdom and the Abbasid Caliphate were the two major powers flanking the Mediterranean, though their capitals lay separated by months of difficult travel across varied terrain. You hear the metallic sound of a gate being unbarred somewhere in the complex, and then the low voices of men preparing the great hall for an audience that will come with the winter day. The sky above Aachen shows a gradual lightening in the east, a pale grey that brings no warmth but merely permits sight. An Abbasid envoy reportedly presents letters of credence at Charlemagne's palace in Aachen, winter 802, though this embassy likely carries no elephant, only preliminary negotiations that may have made the later gift possible. The envoy has come with a modest retinue through the same alpine passes that will one day test the heated stones wrapped in cloth, carried to ease the passage over ice for a creature accustomed to the heat of Mesopotamia. You watch from the shadow of a colonnade as the Eastern delegation is conducted through the inner gates, their silks incongruous against the rough wool of Frankish guards. The particular hollow sound of padded feet on frozen ground, unlike any horse or ox, will not be heard here for several years more. Diplomatic contact between the courts may have been intermittent but sustained, possibly carried in part by Jewish merchants from the Radhanite network who could have conveyed correspondence between them, their trading routes spanning the distance that separated these rulers. The morning advances with a brightness that brings no relief from cold. You move through the palace complex as the audience prepares, your boots crunching on paths that have been cleared of snow and then salted to prevent refreezing. Steam rises from the kitchens where bread is being baked for the court, and you pass near enough to feel the momentary warmth before the cold reasserts itself. Charlemagne's biographer, Einhard, will one day record events in the royal Frankish annals, though the arrival of the elephant still lies in the future that this winter morning anticipates. The exchange occurred during a period when both rulers were consolidating extensive territories. Harun's caliphate spanned from Central Asia to North Africa, while Charlemagne's dominion reached from the Pyrenees to the Elbe. In the great hall, lamps had been lit against the gloom of the short December day. You find a place among the assembled courtiers where you can observe without drawing attention, the press of bodies providing some measure of warmth against the stone walls. The envoy from Baghdad makes his obeisance with the formal gestures of his court, and you notice how the Frankish nobles lean forward with the curiosity of people who have heard reports of a city whose markets distributed sustenance to 1 million souls. Harun's letter, read aloud in Latin translation, speaks of friendship between the two great rulers of East and West, though the full meaning of this overture will only become clear when the elephant Abulabas makes his appearance. Other gifts likely accompanied the elephant, though they are less specifically recorded, textiles and perfumes perhaps, or the mechanical devices for which Baghdad's craftsmen were celebrated. The audience concludes, and you drift with the dispersing crowd into the courtyard where snow has begun to fall again. The sky has lowered to the height of the chapel roof, and individual flakes descend with a deliberation that suggests they will continue for hours. You are standing at the harbour at dawn, except this is no harbour but a palace yard, and the vessels that arrive here come on roads rather than water, though the Tigris and the Rhine both connect to wider networks of movement. The gift may have symbolized recognition of Charlemagne as a legitimate ruler by the distant Caliph, a gesture that would have carried weight if the two powers shared an enemy in the Umayyad Emirate of Cordoba, a remnant of an earlier caliphate that still claimed authority in the Western Mediterranean. The years pass, as years do, with the slow accumulation of seasons that transforms memory into record. You find yourself now in a mountain pass, the summer of 802 having given way to the more famous journey that followed. The elephant, accustomed to the heat of Mesopotamia, labors through alpine snow with heated stones for his feet, the unfamiliar smell of an elephant, musky and vegetal, in a Frankish stable still awaiting him at the journey's end. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes, except these are not merchants, but a specialized caravan, the logistical support that the elephant's journey required across varied terrain, having been assembled with the resources of two great courts. The silence of alpine passes, broken only by the creak of tackle, and the animal's breathing envelops you now, a stillness so complete that you can hear the individual footsteps of the men who walk beside the great beast, their own breath coming hard in the thin air. Steam rises from the animal's back after exertion in cold mountain air, a phenomenon that the Frankish handlers have never witnessed before and will describe in wonder to those who did not make the journey. You walk alongside at a respectful distance, close enough to observe how the heated stones wrapped in cloth are replaced at intervals, the wrappings themselves having begun to scorch where the heat was greatest. A Balabas was the first elephant north of the Alps whose name was recorded in writing, and you understand something of what this meant to the men who accompanied him, the responsibility of transporting a living emblem of imperial prestige through terrain that offered no precedent for such passage. The descent begins, and with it a gradual change in the quality of cold, the wind losing its edge as the elevation decreases. You have lost track of the days spent in transit, the rhythm of travel having compressed time into a sequence of camps and departures, of tending to an animal whose needs were learned through observation rather than inherited knowledge. The Frankish winter would smoke and frost, alien to creatures of the Tigris floodplain, awaits below, though the men who have come from Baghdad have themselves never experienced cold of this duration and intensity. The gift demonstrated Harun's reach and wealth to a European audience unfamiliar with Asian animals, and you sense this demonstration most acutely in the exhaustion of the moment, the impossibility of what has been attempted made visible in the careful placement of each massive foot. The lowlands open before you with a suddenness that the ascent had not prepared you to expect. Fields appear, villages, the ordinary textures of a European landscape that has never known elephant or dromedary. You move now toward Aachen, the destination that has drawn this caravan through such extraordinary effort, and the approach carries its own form of tension, the anticipation of arrival after prolonged uncertainty. The elephant became a symbol of imperial prestige in Charlemagne's Aachen court, though this symbolism must first be established through the act of presentation itself. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes, though these are the final preparations of men who have guarded a precious charge across impossible distance. The palace appears on the horizon with its distinctive silhouette of chapel and hall, the complex that you knew in winter now seen in a different season, the trees showing the fullness of late summer growth. You have arrived, though the arrival itself will be choreographed with the deliberation appropriate to an event without precedent. The elephant stands in the palace courtyard at Aachen, its breath visible in cold morning air, though this cold is months away yet, the present moment still warm enough that the animal's exertions have not produced the steam you witnessed in the mountains. The chronological dislocation is yours, not the narrative's, the compression of years into the experience of a single drifting consciousness. Frankish courtiers gather to watch the animal drink from a river, its trunk moving with alien grace, a scene that will occur in the days following the formal presentation when curiosity has overcome initial reserve. You stand among them now, or rather you stand in the position you have occupied throughout, the observer who is also participant through the grammar of second person that places you inside each moment. The unfamiliar smell of an elephant, musky and vegetal, in a Frankish stable reaches you in anticipation, the stable itself not yet prepared, the animal still being exhibited in the open air where its full scale can be appreciated. Harun's letter, read aloud in Latin translation, still echoes in the memory of those who heard it. The spoken words of friendship between the two great rulers having prepared the ground for this visual confirmation of equality. The days that follow the arrival accumulate into routine, the extraordinary becoming familiar through repetition. You observe the elephant in the palace courtyard at Aachen, its breath visible in cold morning air as the seasons turn toward the winter that will test its adaptation. Diplomatic contact between the courts was intermittent but sustained over years, the elephant serving as living reminder of a connection that required no immediate purpose to maintain its significance. You walk in the courtyard one morning when snow has fallen overnight, the animal's quarters having been modified with additional covering against the Frankish winter, wood smoke and frost, alien to creatures of the Tigris floodplain. The heated stones wrapped in cloth, carried to ease the passage over ice, have been retired now that the journey is complete, though their memory persists in the care with which the handlers continue to attend their charge. Yet the memory of that silence persists in the animal itself, in the stillness of its demeanor when not actively engaged, a quality that observers attribute to wisdom or age, or merely to the nature of elephants. You find yourself returning to this quality in your observations, the way that a balabas seems to exist in a temporal frame different from the urgency of human affairs around him. Charlemagne's biographer, Einhard, recorded the animal's arrival in the Royal Frankish Annals, and you imagine the process of that recording, the selection of detail from among the multitude of possible observations. The years pass. You are standing at the harbour at dawn, except there is no harbour, no dawn, only the slow progression of seasons that brings you to 810, 6 years after the arrival that seemed to promise indefinite continuation. The elephant died in 810, having survived the crossing of the Alpine passes, the annals recording this death with a brevity that belies the effort of the original journey. You feel the weight of this brevity, the reduction of a living presence to a line of text, a foreign marvel become familiar and then merely past. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes, the commerce of the court continuing without reference to the loss that has occurred, the million inhabitants of Baghdad unaware of this small death in a distant capital. The palace courtyard at Aachen shows no mark of the absence, the stones where the elephant stood having been swept clear of snow or dung or any trace of habitation. You stand in this emptiness with the memory of presence, the particular hollow sound of padded feet on frozen ground, unlike any horse or ox, now existing only in the accounts of those who heard it. The gift symbolized the recognition of Charlemagne as a legitimate ruler by the distant Caliph, and that symbolism had been absorbed into the fabric of court life long before the physical symbol expired. Jewish merchants from the Radhanite network may have carried correspondence between the courts still, their routes unaffected by the absence of the elephant that had once been their most visible cargo. You move through the palace complex with the knowledge of what has ended, the unfamiliar smell of an elephant, musky and vegetal, in a Frankish stable now truly unfamiliar, becoming strange through absence rather than through novelty. The cold air moves across your face with the same steady pressure you felt on your first arrival. The Frankish winter would smoke and frost, continuing its cycle without reference to the creature for whom it had been alien. In the scriptorium, a clerk copies the annals, his hand moving with the regularity of practice across the prepared surface. The animal's death is noted briefly, a foreign marvel become familiar, and you observe this notation in its moment of creation, the ink drying into permanence. The sky above the palace shows the pale grey of a winter afternoon, the light failing early in the short day. You find yourself at the edge of the courtyard, your boots having carried you here through paths that have become familiar through repetition. This is the nature of the immersion you have experienced, the being place that constructs experience without claiming it as literal occurrence. The logistical support that the elephant's journey required across varied terrain has been forgotten in its specifics, remembered only as a general quality of difficulty overcome. You stand in the gathering dark with the accumulated weight of these observations, the narrative having moved from anticipation through arrival to conclusion without the drama of conflict, the calm progression of events that mirrors the calm of the voice that has placed you inside them. The stars that guided the Dhow captain from Suraf have risen above Aachen now, the same stars that turned over Baghdad and over the Alpine passes and over every point of the journey that connected them. The darkness is complete, or nearly so, the last light having faded from the western sky. Around you, the city rests, its inhabitants sustained by the commerce that continues without reference to the extraordinary gift that once passed through their midst. You breathe the cold air that moves across your face, the Frankish winter, wood, smoke, and frost, having become familiar through prolonged exposure. The diplomatic contact between the courts was intermittent but sustained over years, and it would continue after the death of Abul-Abbas, the two powers sharing their enemy in the Umayyad Emirate of Cordoba, the recognition of Charlemagne as legitimate ruler having been established and requiring no further demonstration. You stand in the palace courtyard at Aachen, its breath visible in cold morning air, the grammar of present tense asserting itself against the knowledge of past completion. The steam rises from the animal's back after exertion in cold mountain air, this too preserved in the continuous present of narrative memory, the moment of its occurrence having passed, but its representation persisting. You have been placed inside this history, the second person having operated as promised, never breaking into commentary, never reminding you of your position as listener, only offering the continuous texture of immersion. The years have passed, the events have completed their course, the annals have recorded and the clerks have copied, and the memory has settled into the forms that permit its transmission. The darkness is complete, the stars turn. Around you the city rests, and you rest with it, the narrative having reached its natural point of closure, the death of the elephant in 810 marking the boundary beyond which this particular story need not extend. You breathe. The cold air moves across your face. The Frankish winter, wood, smoke, and frost, surrounds you with its particular quality, alien and then familiar, and now merely atmospheric, the setting rather than the subject of consciousness. The resinous smoke of coffee roasting drifts through a narrow lane in Kark, though the dark beans themselves will not reach these streets for many centuries yet, and the warmth gathering here comes from older fuels, from charcoal, and from the breath of men pressed close together in a low room whose ceiling has darkened with the smoke of generations. You are standing at the threshold of this gathering place, the particular quality of lamplight catching the edges of your robe as you pause before entering, the flame inside throwing elongated shadows that move against the plaster when someone shifts upon his cushion. Around you, merchants unload their cargoes from boats that have slipped down the Tigris with the last of daylight, their voices carrying across water that reflects the first stars in trembling fragments. A storyteller's voice rises and falls in the rhythm of classical Arabic prose, and you find a place upon a worn mat near the center of the room, your shoulder brushing that of a porter whose work has ended for the day, whose muscles remember the weight of bales and baskets even as he surrenders them to the narrative unfolding before him. The teller begins the tale of a porter who carried a lady's shopping through secret streets, and you recognize in this opening the architecture of delight that will sustain you through the hours before dawn, the nested promises of revelation that have drawn listeners together in such rooms since, before the frame narrative of Scheherazade and King Shahryar took shape during or after the Abbasid period. The porter in the tale shoulders his burden through alleys that narrow until the sky itself becomes a ribbon, until the walls press so close that his shoulders brush the plaster on either side, and you feel the constriction in your own chest, the pleasurable anticipation of spaces that open suddenly into courtyards where fountains play and musicians await. The stories incorporate Persian, Indian, and Arabic narrative traditions in layers of accumulation, and this porter's journey bears upon its surface the marks of many hands, many tongues, the details shifting with each retelling as professional storytellers performed in coffee houses and marketplaces, adapting tales to local audiences who brought their own expectations to the familiar patterns. You watch the teller's hands move in the lamplight, tracing the porter's path through the secret streets, and the gesture itself seems to belong to no single tradition, to have travelled across the same routes that carried silk and spices and manuscripts between cities whose names echo in the tales as they echo in the markets. Baghdad's cosmopolitan population provided the social setting for tales of merchants, porters, and disguised rulers, and the room around you contains the same mixture that animates the narratives: Arabs and Persians and Turks, and others whose ancestors came from regions beyond the river's reach, all drawn together by the voice that weaves the familiar into the strange. The Tigris River and its bridges appear repeatedly as settings for chance encounters, and the teller pauses now to let his listeners feel the water moving beneath the arches, to hear the particular sound of oars in the dark, the splash that marks a body falling from a bridge, a narrative moment, then silence. You are standing upon that bridge in imagination, the stone warm still from the day's heat, the water below invisible until a star finds its surface and is swallowed by the current that carries all things toward the sea. The figure of the Caliph who walks disguised among his people may reflect actual Abbasid practice of informal inspection, and the teller's voice drops to a whisper as he describes the three men who slip through the gate of Kufa after dark, two companions behind him, their robes deliberately plain, their speech the rough dialect of the streets rather than the measured cadences of the court. Harun al-Rashid appears as a character in many of the tales, though the historical figure and the literary character diverge significantly, and the man who passes through this gate in the story is already becoming someone other than the governor who held audiences in the palace on the western bank, already the wanderer who will discover what his messengers cannot convey. The oldest surviving fragments of the Nights date to the 9th century, the era of Harun's reign, and the voice that speaks him now carries within it the trace of that distant time, the particular intonations that scholars will later recognize in manuscripts copied by hands long since returned to dust. Jafar the Barmakid appears alongside Harun in the tales, preserving a memory of their historical partnership, and the teller gives him now his proper place at the Caliph's right hand, the vizier whose counsel steered the empire through its most expansive years, whose family name will resonate in these stories long after the historical Jafar has fallen from favor, long after the Barmakid wealth has been confiscated and scattered. You feel the presence of this layered memory in the room, the way the tale holds within it not only the moment of its telling, but the sediment of earlier tellings, the stories circulated in oral performance before being committed to writing, preserved in the voices of those who carried them across generations like porters shouldering burdens whose contents they had never seen. Rosewater sprinkled on guests' hands, the gesture preserved in tale after tale, marks the moment when the porter in the story enters the lady's chamber, the ritual greeting that transforms the stranger into the welcomed, that prepares the body for the pleasures to follow. You smell it now in imagination, the distilled essence of flowers grown in gardens that lie beyond the city's northern walls, the faint sweetness that clings to the fingers long after the liquid has evaporated. The creak of a door opening to a hidden garden, described so often it becomes archetype, sounds in the teller's rendering, and you find yourself passing through that same doorway, the darkness of the street giving way to the deeper darkness of foliage, the scent of jasmine, and the sound of water falling into a basin that has been shaped to receive it. The Nights, as we know them, were compiled in Cairo during the Mamluk period, centuries after Harun, and this garden you enter through the door of language has been tended by hands that never knew Baghdad, that shaped its paths according to Egyptian conventions, that planted species unknown to the Abbasid gardeners. Yet something persists, some quality of enclosure and surprise that transcends the particular details, that speaks to the listener across the distances of time and space. The collection reflects the multicultural environment of Abbasid cities, where Arabs, Persians, Turks, and others mingled, and the garden in the tale contains this mingling in its very soil. The irrigation channels following Persian models, the flowering plants brought from Indian gardens by merchants who traveled the maritime routes, the architectural features that speak of Byzantine craftsmen employed at the Caliph's command. You walk these paths in imagination, the gravel crunching beneath your feet, the moon appearing between leaves whose shape you cannot quite determine, and the teller's voice continues its measured rise and fall, carrying you toward the moment of transformation that awaits in every such garden, the revelation that will alter the porter's understanding of his own existence. The historical Harun and the literary Harun diverge, one a governor of empire, the other a wanderer in his own city, and this divergence opens between them a space that the tales have occupied for centuries, a territory of possibility where the constraints of actual governance yield to the freedoms of narrative. You understand this now as you stand in the garden of the tale, the lamplight from the house behind you finding its way between branches to mark your path with moving patches of illumination. The Caliph in the stories slips through the gate of Kufa after dark, two companions behind him, and this movement through darkness is itself a kind of liberation, the temporary dissolution of identity that permits the discovery of truths unavailable to the enthroned ruler. Themes of transformation, disguise, and sudden reversal of fortune mirror the volatility of Abbasid court politics, and the garden you traverse contains within its walls the same precariousness, the same possibility that the welcome extended to the porter may become threat, that the lady whose shopping he carried may prove to be other than she appeared, that the night itself may end in execution, or in marriage, or in flight beyond the city's gates. The stories preserve details of daily life, from food preparation to legal procedures, that historical chronicles omit, and the teller lingers now upon the meal that the porter receives, the bread baked in the communal oven and brought still warm, the stew whose ingredients he names with the precision of one who has prepared such dishes himself, the sequence of courses, and the etiquette of their consumption that marks the porter as outsider, even as the hospitality attempts to absorb him. You taste these foods in imagination, the particular combination of spices that identifies the cook's origin, the texture of meat long simmered until it yields to the tongue, the sweetness of preserved fruits that arrives at the meal's end to signal the transition from sustenance to pleasure. The frame narrative structure of nested stories may derive from Indian models transmitted through Persian, and this meal itself contains such nesting, the story within the story of its preparation, the hands that kneaded the dough holding within their muscle memory the techniques learned from mothers and grandmothers, whose own teachers came from villages beyond the horizon of known geography. A merchant in the tale unrolls a carpet that proves to be a flying device, the tigress shrinking below, and the teller's voice lifts with this moment of miraculous transportation, carrying his listeners above the city they know so well, revealing its layout as only the birds and the angels normally perceive it. You feel the wind of this passage, the sudden vertigo of height. The carpets weave rough against your palms as you grip its edges against the rushing air. Below, the river becomes a ribbon of silver in the moonlight, the bridges reduced to threads upon which no human figure could be distinguished, the quarters of the city merging into a pattern whose meaning eludes you even as its beauty arrests your breath. From this impossible height, you understand why the river and its crossings concentrate human passage into moments of proximity that generate narrative possibility, the accidental brush of sleeves that leads to recognition or to violence or to the long unfolding of stories that will occupy the nights to come. The carpet banks above the palace quarter, and you glimpse gardens that correspond to the one you entered through the creaking door, the same fountains visible now from above, the same path forming patterns that only make sense from this perspective. This carpet itself embodies such layering, its weave following techniques brought from Central Asia, its design incorporating the arabesques developed in Abbasid workshops, its function as vehicle of miraculous transport belonging to a stratum of narrative that originated in regions far to the east, beyond the mountains that mark the boundary of the empire's effective reach. You descend with it now, the merchant's command bringing it gently to earth in a square whose location you do not recognize, the landing so soft that the dust barely rises from the beaten earth, the night so still that you hear the breathing of animals stabled nearby, the distant murmur of voices from a house where the inhabitants have not yet surrendered to sleep. Scheherazade pauses at dawn, her story unfinished, the king's curiosity preserving her for another night, and the teller in the Kark coffee house marks this pause with a gesture of his own, his hand lifting to acknowledge the light that has begun to show at the edges of the room's single window, the night of listening having passed more swiftly than any could have measured. You feel the weight of this interruption, the frustration of narrative suspended at the moment of its greatest tension, the promise that sustains itself through deferral, that generates its power precisely from the refusal of completion. This morning pause belongs to that framing, the structure that permits infinite extension, the 1,001 nights that become conceivable only through the mechanism of curiosity held perpetually in suspense, the king's desire to know preventing the execution that would end both the telling and the teller. The room around you stirs with the approaching day, the porter beside you shifting his weight as muscles stiff from immobility demand movement, the merchants who will return to their boats rising to make their farewells in voices thickened by the night's concentration. The particular quality of lamplight in a narrow street where walls lean close together yields, now, to the grey diffusion of dawn, the flame paling to invisibility even before it is extinguished, the shadows that moved so dramatically against the plaster now retreating into the ordinary textures of wall and floor. You rise with the others, your body remembering the weight of the carpet's flight, the taste of the meal that existed only in language, the garden whose paths you walked without leaving your place upon the mat. This night you have participated in that circulation, your listening body completing the circuit that runs from teller to told and back again, the story altered imperceptibly by your presence, by the quality of attention you brought to its unfolding. The teller gathers his robe about him as he prepares to depart, his voice hoarse from the night's exertion, his fingers stained with the ink of notes he made during pauses in the performance, reminders to himself of variants he might introduce on some future evening. A manuscript copied in Cairo 4 centuries later preserves phrases that echo Abbasid Baghdad, and this voice you have heard will reach that manuscript through channels neither straight nor simple, through the distortions of memory and the interventions of editors who shaped the collection according to tastes formed in a different city, under different political arrangements, for audiences whose expectations had been modified by centuries of narrative development. You move toward the door, the cold air moving across your face as you emerge into the lane, the river smell stronger now with the morning's freshness, the sound of oars resuming as boats that have waited through the night begin their passages. You find yourself walking toward the nearest crossing, drawn by the narrative logic that has permeated your consciousness through the hours of listening. On the bridge you pause to watch a man in plain robes whose bearing nevertheless suggests authority, whose glance at the water below seems to measure not only its depth, but the temper of those who labor upon it. The bridge empties, as the city completes its transition into day, the night wanderers seeking their beds, the day workers emerging to occupy the spaces they have vacated. The splash of a body falling from a bridge, a narrative moment, then silence, echoes in your memory as you stand at the railing, though no such event has occurred, though the water below moves with only the ordinary disturbances of current and of boats passing. You understand now how the oldest fragments have survived, not through the permanence of stone or the deliberate preservation of archives, but through the continuity of telling, the obstinate refusal of human communities to abandon stories that have given shape to their nights, that have provided the frame within which their own experiences could be comprehended and transmitted. The bridge you cross now embodies this mingling in its very construction, the piers following Roman techniques, the arch profile influenced by Persian engineering, the decorative elements that speak of craftsmen from regions beyond any single imperial definition. Your feet find the irregularities of its surface, the wear of generations having created a topography that maps the passage of countless individuals, each carrying their own stories, their own reasons for crossing from one bank to the other. In the texture of this stone, you read a similar preservation to that of the tales, the marks of rope and of wheels and of feet bare and shod, the stains of substances spilled in passage, the accumulation of ordinary existence that outlasts the grand events whose memory the chronicles attempt to secure. You reach the western bank where the palace quarter rises, its walls concealing gardens where the fountains play even now, where the jasmine releases its scent into air that warms with the advancing day. The creak of a door opening to a hidden garden sounds in imagination as you pass an entrance whose guard seems momentarily absent, whose latch has been left unfastened in the night's confusion. You do not enter, the boundary between listener and tale having strengthened with the daylight, but you pause to inhale the fragrance that escapes, to hear the water that falls into the basin shaped to receive it, to feel for a moment the possibility of passage that the narrative has opened in your consciousness. This garden you almost enter contains such nesting, the paths leading to further enclosures, the fountains concealing mechanisms that create illusions of greater depth, the very air thick with the stories that have been told in its shade across the centuries of its existence. The sun has cleared the horizon now, and the city assumes the particular quality of light that belongs to early morning in these latitudes, the long shadows that precede the day's heat, the colors still saturated before the dust of passage begins to veil them. You turn from the garden's gate, resuming your path along streets that narrow until the sky becomes a ribbon, until the walls press so close that your shoulders brush the plaster on either side. The porter in the tale carried his burden through such streets, and your own steps now trace his route in reverse, emerging from the secret passages into the broader thoroughfares where commerce resumes its daily dominance. Rosewater sprinkled on guests' hands seems to cling still to your fingers, though you have received no such greeting, though the morning's transactions will proceed without such ritual observance, the practical exchanges of market life, requiring no transformation of the stranger into the welcomed. The teller's voice rises and falls in memory as you walk, its rhythm persisting in your own breathing, the cadences of classical Arabic prose having imposed their pattern upon your consciousness through the hours of attentive listening. You understand now the nature of this adaptation, the way each telling responds to the particular composition of its listeners, the way your own presence in that room has shaped the tale you received, the details emphasized or elided, the pacing accelerated or prolonged according to signs of comprehension or of fatigue that the teller reads in the faces before him. The resinous smoke of coffee roasting drifts through the lane in memory, though the dark beans themselves will not reach these streets for many centuries yet, and the warmth you feel now comes from the sun ascending toward its noon height, from the exertion of walking, from the interior knowledge of having participated in something that will continue without your presence, that has continued before it, the narrative stream that carries all tellers and all listeners toward its own unimaginable conclusion. You emerge into a square where the morning market has established itself, the stalls displaying goods whose names the tale supplied, the spices and textiles and implements of daily life that formed the porter's burden, that constitute the merchant's wealth, that provide the setting within which the narratives of gain and loss, of transformation and recognition, acquire their specific gravity. This square contains that population in its morning concentration, the languages crossing and recrossing in the negotiations of price and quality, the gestures of greeting and of refusal that belong to no single tradition, but have emerged from the long proximity of peoples whose ancestors came from every region the empire touched. You move through this crowd as the Caliph moves in the tales, anonymous, observant, the disguised witness whose presence generates no special notice, whose authority exists only in potential, in the knowledge of what could be summoned should the ordinary protections of identity prove insufficient. You feel this divergence now as a kind of freedom, the release from the obligations of fixed position that permits the discovery of what exists beyond the boundaries of prescribed role. The square around you contains this volatility in its very arrangement, the stalls of the wealthy placed where the crowd must pass, the beggars positioned to intercept the charitable, the guards whose presence indicates the proximity of power without revealing its exact location. You purchase bread from a vendor whose hands move with the efficiency of long practice, the exchange of coin and commodity completed without words, the transaction belonging to a world that requires no narrative elaboration, that exists in the interstices of the tales as the foundation upon which their extravagances rest. The bread warms your hands as you continue, the morning's chill dissipating with the sun's ascent, the city completing its transition into the full activity of day. This bread you carry has been shaped by hands that never knew the Abbasid capital, that learned their craft in a city whose dominance had replaced Baghdad's, whose storytellers preserved the names and settings of the older center even as their own experience belonged to different streets, different rivers, different configurations of power and of daily life. Yet the bread sustains, as the tales sustain, the particular nourishment of form that persists across the substitutions of content, the hunger for pattern that finds satisfaction in the recurrence of familiar structures, even when the details have been altered beyond recognition. You find a place to sit near the river's edge, the water moving past with the steady purpose that has carried boats and their cargoes since before the city rose upon these banks, that will continue when the city has become the subject of tales itself, when Baghdad exists only in the narratives that preserve its name, in the manuscripts copied and recopied across the centuries of its diminishment. You understand now the melancholy of such preservation, the way the echo testifies to the absence of the original voice, the way the copy substitutes its own materiality for the lost presence that motivated its production. The bread tastes of this substitution, of the grain that grew in different soil, of the water that carried different minerals, of the fire that burned at a different intensity, yet still recognizably bread, still capable of sustaining the body that consumes it, still participating in the category that transcends any particular instance. The sun has reached the height where its warmth becomes insistent, where the morning's pleasures yield to the necessities of shade and rest. You rise from your place, brushing the crumbs from your robe, the taste of the bread lingering as the taste of the tale lingers, as the particular quality of lamplight in a narrow street where walls lean close together, persists in memory against the brightness of the day that now holds you fully, that requires no narrative to justify its existence, that simply continues as the river continues, carrying all things toward the sea from which they came, and to which, in time, they will return. The particular presence that once marked them dispersed into the general atmosphere of a world that continues without them. The Islamic Golden Age, that civilization developed under the Abbasids from 750 onward, unfolds in the streets where you walk, in the workshops and observatories and hospitals that have transformed the city, founded in 762, into something the world has not seen before. Baghdad became the primary center within decades, and now, in the reign of Al-Mamun from 813 to 833, that cultural peak extends beyond Harun's death into an era of systematic inquiry that touches every discipline of human knowledge. You find yourself walking through the quarter where scholars gather, where the afternoon heat is broken by the shadow of covered arcades, and the murmur of conversation drifts from open doorways. The particular warmth of a brass instrument left in afternoon sun reaches your fingers as you pause beside an astronomer preparing his equipment, the metal retaining the day's heat even as the shadows lengthen across the courtyard. Around you, merchants discuss the prices of paper and ink, of copper vessels and glass retorts, the commerce of learning as steady as the commerce of spices and silk that has built this city's wealth. The Arabic prefix al marks the origin of fundamental terms in algebra, alchemy, alcohol, and alkali, and you hear it in the fragments of conversation that reach your ears, the al of aljaba and alchemia, the definite article that has traveled with concepts into languages yet unborn. The astronomer lifts his brass quadrant from its velvet wrapping, the instrument's surface inscribed with minute gradations that catch the fading light. He is preparing for the evening's work, for the observation of stars whose positions will determine the calendar dates that govern religious observance and the prayer times that structure the devout life. Astronomical observation was pursued for both religious and scientific purposes, and the rooftop platforms of Baghdad have become places where the sacred and the empirical meet without contradiction. You watch him test the tripod's stability against the slight breeze that rises with evening, his movements deliberate and unhurried, the warmth of the brass gradually yielding to the cooler air as the sun descends toward the western horizon. The sky deepens through shades of amber and rose, and the first stars emerge in the eastern darkness where the dome of the sky curves away from human habitation. Ink made from soot floating on water sits prepared in the astronomer's chamber below, the black particles suspended in liquid that will soon record angles and times with precision that earlier generations could not achieve. The systematic use of zero as a number and placeholder developed from Indian sources through Arabic mathematical texts, and this nothingness, this circle that signifies both absence and position, has begun to transform the calculations that the astronomer will perform through the night hours. You imagine the figures taking shape on paper that did not exist in this region before the knowledge spread from Chinese prisoners captured at the Battle of Talas in 751. The paper manufacture learned from those prisoners, now producing the fine white surfaces on which the heavens may be measured and known. The smell of fresh paper pulp, alkaline and slightly grassy, reaches you from a workshop nearby where the evening shift tends the frames of woven mesh on which the new material settles from its watery suspension. A paper mill on the city's outskirts turns rag into fine white sheets, the new material replacing papyrus and parchment, and the abundance of this writing surface has enabled the accumulation of knowledge that papyrus could not sustain, the brittle scrolls of Egypt giving way to the flexible, durable pages that fold and stack and travel. You observe the workers lifting the damp sheets, pressing them between felt, hanging them in rows where the night air will complete what heat and chemistry have begun. The pulp's alkaline scent mingles with the charcoal smoke of nearby kitchens, with the distant perfume of night-blooming flowers in a courtyard garden, with the particular mineral scent of the river that flows past the city's edge, carrying trade from the north and the south in vessels that never cease their movement. The astronomer has mounted to his rooftop now, his silhouette visible against the deepening blue where Venus has appeared as the evening star. The Ptolemaic system was received, studied, and gradually modified by Arabic-speaking astronomers, and the tables he consults represent generations of refinement, of correction, of patient comparison between prediction and observation that has begun to suggest where the ancient Greek models may require adjustment. You stand at the threshold of the stair, feeling the cool air move across your face, hearing the soft click of brass against brass as the instrument is aligned, the whisper of his robe as he moves between the tripod and his recording table. The warmth of the brass has entirely dissipated now, replaced by the neutral temperature of metal that has found equilibrium with the night. Yet the instrument retains its capacity to measure with precision what the unaided eye cannot quantify. Your feet carry you downward through the building, past chambers where other scholars work, past the faint glow of lamps where texts are being copied, translated, commented upon. The cultural peak of the Abbasid Caliphate is generally dated to the reign of Al-Mamun, 813 to 833, extending beyond Harun's death, and the patronage that flows from the Caliph's treasury sustains this activity through the hours when others sleep. You emerge into a street that leads toward the hospital quarter, where the Barmakids receive those who suffer, the first hospitals established under Abbasid rule, providing care regardless of ability to pay. Medical practice built on Galenic theory while adding clinical observations from hospital practice, and the physicians who move through these wards have read the ancient Greek texts in translation, have tested the descriptions of pulse and complexion and the progression of fevers against the actual bodies that present themselves for treatment. The entrance to the Barmakids opens before you, a courtyard visible within where a fountain plays in the lamplight, the waters sound mingling with the low voices of attendants and the occasional murmur of patients who cannot sleep. You are shown through to a ward where rows of beds line the walls, where the physician you seek bends over a man whose wrist he holds between his fingers, counting the beats against the descriptions he has memorized from Galen. The dry taste of medicinal preparations, alum and myrrh and ground pearl, lingers in the air from the pharmacy adjoining this room, the substances ground and mixed according to formulations that combine Greek theory with Persian and Indian and local Arabic practice. The physician releases his patient's wrist, makes a notation in the record that will be preserved for future reference, for the accumulation of cases that gradually refines understanding of what the human body presents in its various states of disorder. You observe the ward's organization, the separation of cases according to the nature of their affliction, the attention to cleanliness and air, and the preparation of food appropriate to each condition. This principle of universal access, rooted in religious obligation, has created institutions where the poor receive the same attention as the wealthy, where the traveler finds care as readily as the city's established residents. A patient coughs softly in the corner, and an attendant moves to offer water in a copper vessel, the metal's sheen catching the lamplight as he bends. The dry taste of medicinal preparations persists in your awareness as you watch, the substances that will be administered at the hours prescribed by the physician's judgment rather than by rote following of ancient authority. The physician turns to wash his hands in a basin prepared for the purpose, the water scented with rose, and the astringent properties of alum. You perceive in his movements the integration of book learning and direct experience, the framework that provides the initial guidance, and the clinical observation that modifies, corrects, occasionally overturns what the texts assert. He dries his hands on linen that has been changed since the last examination, and you follow him through to the pharmacy where copper vessels, heating over charcoal for chemical preparation, announce the ongoing work of preparing medicines. The dry taste of medicinal preparations seems almost tangible in this atmosphere where transformation is the constant activity, where substances are purified and combined according to principles that chemistry, as an experimental discipline, is only beginning to articulate from the practical traditions of metallurgy and medicine. The pharmacist, an older man with stained fingers and precise movements, stirs a preparation in a glass vessel, observing the color change that indicates the reaction has reached its desired point. Chemistry, as an experimental discipline, emerged from the practical traditions of metallurgy and medicine, and the knowledge accumulated in workshops like this one in the attempts to transform base metals and to cure disease will eventually be recognized as something distinct from the philosophical speculation that previously claimed to explain material change. You watch the liquid clarify, the impurities settling as sediment that will be filtered away, the pure substance reserved for its intended use. The acrid edge of sublimating compounds surrounds you with the evidence of human patience, of the willingness to repeat operations until they yield consistent results, to record the conditions that produce success and those that lead to failure. Your presence here is tolerated without comment, the hospital's openness extending to observers as to patients, the dissemination of knowledge considered a virtue in itself. You return to the courtyard where the fountain continues its unvarying music, the water rising and falling in patterns that have been calculated for aesthetic effect, as well as for the cooling of the air. The night has advanced, and the sky visible through the courtyard's opening shows the progress of stars that the astronomer you left earlier will be noting with his brass instrument, its warmth now a memory replaced by the cool precision of metal that has found its working temperature in the night air. Baghdad, founded in 762, became the primary center within decades, and this concentration of institutions, of scholars and practitioners, of libraries and laboratories and observatories, constitutes the physical manifestation of the Islamic Golden Age, that civilization developed under the Abbasids from 750 onward. You pass through the gate into streets that lead toward the river, where the paper mills and their associated workshops cluster along the water that powers their machinery and provides the medium in which pulp is suspended and transformed. The smell of fresh paper pulp greets you before you reach the building where the night shift continues the work begun by day, the process requiring constant attention over many hours. You observe the transformation of discarded linen, of worn garments and sail fragments, into the substance on which the accumulated learning of this civilization will be preserved and transmitted. The workers lift the frames, shake them gently to even the distribution of fibers, set them to drain in racks that multiply through the long chamber. The river's presence is audible here, the current against the mill wheel, the splash of water returning to its channel after performing its work. Paper manufacture, learned from Chinese prisoners at the Battle of Talas in 751, spread through the Islamic world with remarkable speed, the technique traveling westward along the same routes that carried silk and spices, and the exchange of ideas that characterized this period of connectedness across vast distances. You touch a sheet that has already dried, feeling its slight texture, its flexibility, its capacity to receive ink without bleeding or feathering. Ink made from soot floating on water is prepared in an adjoining chamber where the carbon black is collected from lamps burning with restricted flame, the particles gathered on cooled surfaces, and then mixed with binding agents that fix them to the paper. You observe the suspension, the soot neither sinking entirely nor floating away, but held in colloidal distribution by the careful preparation of the medium. The astronomer whose work you witnessed earlier will use this fluid to record the positions he measures, the angles and times that will be compared with the predictions of tables, the discrepancies that will suggest where correction is needed. This represents the marriage of practical craft with theoretical purpose, the material conditions that make abstract inquiry possible. Your path continues through the manufacturing quarter, past workshops where glass is blown and metal is forged, where the instruments of scientific observation are produced with the same skill that creates vessels for domestic use and decoration for the wealthy. The Islamic Golden Age manifests in these objects as in the texts and institutions, the material culture that supports and extends the reach of the mind. You find yourself approaching a building from which music issues, the sound of a lute being tuned, of voices in discussion that pauses and resumes as the instrument's pitch is adjusted. The resonance of a lute body, wood and gut and shell, in a tiled reception room envelops you as you enter, the acoustics of the space amplifying and enriching the tone in ways that the musicians present have studied and understand. Musical theory incorporated Persian and Greek systems, with detailed treatises on intervals and instruments, and the gathering you observe represents the practical application of this learning, the translation of mathematical proportion into audible harmony. A man with graying hair plucks a single string, listens intently, adjusts the peg with minute rotation, plucks again to confirm the pitch has reached its intended frequency. You settle against the wall where cushions have been placed for listeners, your presence again accepted without ceremony. The musicians gather to debate the proper intervals of the lute, string lengths measured with geometric precision, and you perceive in their discussion the same integration of inherited knowledge with direct observation that characterizes the other disciplines of this civilization. The resonance of the lute continues to sound as each string is brought into relation with the others, the whole instrument gradually achieving the tuning that will permit the performance of compositions whose complexity reflects the mathematical sophistication of their creators. The patronage that supports such gatherings, that enables the leisure for theoretical discussion of musical proportion, flows from the same source that sustains the observatories and hospitals. The lute is finally deemed ready, and the musician begins a piece that moves through modes you recognize, and others that belong to traditions less familiar, the Persian and Greek systems integrated into something that is neither yet also both. Your ear, attuned by the evening's exposure, begins to perceive the structural principles underlying the apparent flow of melody, the ratios of vibration that determine consonance, and the deliberate departures from simple ratio that create the tensions of artistic expression. The physical presence of sound moves through air and strikes the delicate mechanism of the ear, carrying these complexities to your attention with an immediacy that written description could not achieve. Your eyes have grown heavy with the lateness of the hour, with the accumulation of impressions that the night has brought. You allow them to close, to rest against the sound, the lute's melody continuing as a thread on which your attention may lightly rest without the effort of directed focus. This concept, too, finds its musical analogue in the rests, the silences that structure rhythm, the absence that is also presence in the pattern of sound and non-sound. The performance concludes, and the musicians turn to conversation that drifts across topics of mathematics and astronomy, of the proper methods for determining the Qibla and the times of prayer, of the travels of merchants who have returned with reports of lands beyond the familiar boundaries. Geographical knowledge expanded through both systematic scholarship and the reports of merchants and travelers, and the accumulation of these reports, the comparison of distances and directions, the construction of maps that attempted to represent the spherical Earth on flat surfaces, constituted another branch of the learning that this civilization cultivated. You remain resting, your breathing slow and regular, the voices around you becoming part of the texture of the night rather than distinct messages requiring interpretation. A merchant's navigational manual combines stellar observations with practical harbor descriptions from Suraf to Canton, and you hear fragments of such a text being discussed, the particulars of currents and landmarks, of seasons favorable for departure and arrival, of the goods that may be exchanged at each port, and the characters of the rulers who control them. The manual that is its subject represents the practical synthesis of these sources, the knowledge that enables the caravans and the ships to move with reasonable expectation of reaching their destinations, of returning with profit that sustains the commerce that sustains the learning. The resonance of the lute has faded to memory, replaced by the murmur of voices that itself gradually fades as the gathering disperses, as individuals depart to their rest or to other occupations of the night hours. You remain, your consciousness hovering at the edge of sleep, the room around you present as warmth and the scent of rose water and the distant sound of the fountain in a courtyard somewhere beyond the walls. Al-Khwarizmi, working in Baghdad under Al-Mamun, systematized algebra and gave his name to the algorithm, and you see in half-imagined vision a figure bent over tablets in the lamplight, the Hindu numerals still unfamiliar to his generation, the shapes of 1 and 2 and 3 that we now take for granted being then innovations whose utility he was among the first to recognize and demonstrate. The 02 appears in your drifting imagination, the circle that contains nothing yet enables everything, the placeholder that distinguishes 10 from 1, that makes positional notation possible, and with it the arithmetic that will eventually power the calculations of ages yet to come. The figure in your vision works steadily, his pen moving across the paper that the mills of this city produce, the ink made from soot floating on water recording operations that previous generations performed with words, with rhetorical descriptions that lacked the concision and clarity of symbolic representation. The Al-Khwarizmi, the algorithmy, becomes through Latin corruption the algorithm that now names any systematic procedure, any finite sequence of well-defined instructions. You observe his concentration, the slight frown as he verifies a calculation, the relaxation of his shoulders as the result confirms what intuition had suggested, the methodical progression through cases that establishes the general rule through sufficient particular instances. The lamplight in your vision flickers slightly, the flame responding to some current of air that enters from the night outside, and the Hindu numerals seem to glow with their own particular quality, the new learning that transforms what had been difficult into what is merely careful, the labor of calculation reduced to rules that any diligent student may follow. The concentration of scholars that this city achieved, the libraries and the salons and the court patronage, created the conditions in which such systematization became possible, in which the scattered achievements of earlier civilizations could be gathered, translated, compared, and advanced. The figure in your vision pauses, rubs his eyes, reaches for the water that sits beside his work, and drinks with the slow appreciation of one whose concentration has been long sustained. Your own consciousness drifts further now, the boundary between vision and dream becoming indistinct, the room around you and the room in Baghdad merging into a single space of lamplight and shadow. Optics was advanced through experimental work on light and vision, particularly by Ibn al-Haytham later in the period. And though this work lies in the future from the moment you have been observing, the method it will employ, the careful testing of hypothesis against observation, the mathematical analysis of how light travels and how the eye receives it, continues the approach that Al-Khwarizmi exemplifies in his systematic treatment of equations. The smell of fresh paper pulp reaches you from somewhere in the manufacturing quarter, the night shift completing what the day shift began, the continuous production that supplies the endless need for writing surfaces. This replacement of older materials, this transformation of the material basis of knowledge, enables the proliferation of texts that in turn enables the proliferation of readers, of students, of scholars who will advance what they have received. The Islamic Golden Age rests on such material foundations as much as on the genius of individuals, on the paper and the ink and the instruments that make abstract thought communicable and cumulative. Your breathing has become the breathing of one who rests deeply, the surface of consciousness still lightly touched by the impressions of the night, but the depths below settling into the patterns of restoration. The acrid edge of sublimating compounds lingers as an olfactory memory, the pharmacy's atmosphere translated into the chemistry of your own body, the transformations of metabolism that continue their patient work as you rest. The body you inhabit performs its own chemistry with a sophistication that surpasses any conscious art. The alchemy of digestion and respiration and the slow repair of tissue that constitutes the physical substrate of thought itself. The dry taste of medicinal preparations returns as a phantom sensation. The physician's pharmacy merging with you are standing beside a low marble fountain where water lilies float in ceramic bowls, and the sound of the family's private dinner drifts from screened windows above. The clink of cups and the murmur of conversation between Yahya and his sons, Jafar and Al-Fadl, voices that have guided the affairs of the Abbasid Caliphate through nearly 2 decades of expansion and consolidation. Around you, torches have been lit along the garden path in anticipation of the guest's departure, their flames pulling in long ribbons toward the cool air descending from the north, and the particular scent of orange blossom water lingers from the hand-washing basins carried through earlier by silent servants. The Barmakid family's power ended suddenly in 8-3, though no one gathered here suspects that the end is hours away, that the very familiarity of this scene contains its own vulnerability, the long intimacy between patron and ministers having accumulated resentments invisible to those who enjoy its fruits. The metallic taste of fear, sudden and chemical, arrives first as a disturbance in the garden's acoustic texture, the rhythm of booted feet on gravel where sandals alone should pass, and you turn to observe the palace guards assembling at the outer gate in formations too ordered for social ceremony. Their commander holds a folded document whose wax seal catches the torchlight, and the specific reasons for their fall remain historically unclear even now, variously attributed to fiscal disputes, personal conflict, or dynastic politics. But in this moment, the cause matters less than the fact of interruption itself, the violation of a threshold that had seemed permanently secure. Through the screened windows, Jafar's voice rises in laughter at some private joke, then stops as the first shouts reach the dining chamber, the silence that follows more terrible than any clamor could have been. The destruction of the Barmakids shocked contemporaries accustomed to their apparently secure position, and you feel that shock now as a physical stillness in your own body, the fountain's trickle suddenly loud in the absence of human speech from above, the lilies motionless on their stagnant water. Harun signs the order of arrest in a chamber removed from the garden, his hand steady after years of dependence, on the same men whose fates he now seals with deliberate strokes of reed pen on prepared paper. You are not present in that room, but the evening air carries its own intelligence, and you sense the Caliph's solitude in the altered breathing of the palace, the withdrawal of servants from corridors that would normally bustle with preparations for the night's continuation. The document specifies names that have appeared together on countless previous orders of state: Yahya ibn Khalid, Jafar ibn Yahya, Al-Fadl ibn Yahya. The repetition of patronymics, suddenly a litany of loss rather than of lineage, and the particular cold of a palace prison awaits those whose written fate this paper determines. The Barmakid fall may have been connected to Harun's desire to assert direct control before his own death, a death that followed 6 years later in 8-9 at Tus, in Khorasan, during a campaign. But on this evening, in 8-3, the Caliph lives in the imperative of severance, the necessary violence of autonomy reclaimed. Incense has been lit in the corridor outside his chamber, though whether to sanctify or to obscure the document's purpose remains ambiguous in the drifting smoke that reaches you where you wait in the garden's shadowed corner. The orange blossoms now overlaid with the sharper note of agawad and something else, something like the residue of previous ceremonies conducted in this same space, previous signatures that had elevated rather than destroyed. Jafar in his cell, the same hands that had held the seals of empire now counting the stones of the wall, each irregularity in the masonry, a landmark in the topography of confinement. You are standing in the underground passage that connects the palace prisons to the administrative quarters above, and the particular cold of a palace prison, underground, where no sun reaches, seeps through your garments as though the stone itself exhales the accumulated chill of centuries. The passage's curvature prevents you from seeing the cell's interior, but the acoustic properties of the space carry the faint percussion of fingers against fitted limestone, a counting that has no numerical purpose beyond the occupation of consciousness in extremity. The family's later literary reputation for generosity contrasts sharply with their violent end, and you imagine the stories already forming in the markets above, the transformation of living men into exemplars of virtue retroactively bestowed, the generosity that had been political calculation becoming moral absolute in the alchemy of violent removal. Water drips somewhere in the passage farther reaches, each drop distinct in the silence that surrounds it, and the smell of damp earth mingles with the residue of previous occupants, the organic persistence of human presence in spaces designed for its erasure. Jafar ibn Yahya was executed. His father Yahya and brother Al-Fadl were imprisoned, and the grammar of that sentence, its semicolon and its finality, contains in miniature the disproportion of the family's fate, 1 death and 2 lingering punishments, the variation itself a form of cruelty that prevents shared consolation. The silence between brothers who have become enemies belongs to a later period, to the years after Harun's own death in 8-9 at Tus, in Khorasan, during that campaign against the Khorasanian rebels. But its seeds germinate in the very atmosphere of the prison passage where you continue to stand, the drip of water marking intervals that no longer correspond to any human schedule. You ascend through a stairway that emerges into a courtyard transformed by dawn, the garden where you stood hours before now visible in the grey light as a space emptied of its previous significance, the fountain still trickling, the lilies beginning to open with vegetative indifference to political catastrophe. Harun's reign, for all its brilliance, contained the seeds of later fragmentation in its very success, and you perceive this now in the very completeness of the night's transformation, the ease with which power could reconfigure the visible world, the instability that such ease implies for any configuration, however apparently permanent. The air carries the first warmth of the approaching day, a warmth that will intensify into the fever heat of a tent in a foreign landscape, though that tent and that fever belong to the Caliph's own final years, still 6 years distant from this morning's grey particularity. Fever heat in a tent, the patient's own body betraying him in a foreign landscape, and you are standing at the entrance to that tent in the year 89, the campaign having brought the Caliph far from the round city he had inherited, far from the gardens where the Barmakid's fate was sealed. The silk panels of the tent's interior glow with the particular orange of transmitted lamplight, and within that glow Harun al-Rashid lies on cushions that have been arranged and rearranged by physicians whose whispered consultations reach you in fragments through the entrance flap. The dry taste of medicinal preparations returns, alum and myrrh and ground pearl, the physician's pharmacy now applied to a body that has performed its own chemistry for 50 years of demanding rule, the alchemy of digestion and respiration, and the slow repair of tissue that constitutes the physical substrate of thought itself, now faltering in the heat of infection. You do not enter the tent, but the air that moves past you carries the particular density of fever, the moisture of a body metabolizing itself toward conclusion, and the landscape beyond the encampment stretches in darkness toward the Iranian plateau, the city of Tus, indistinguishable from its surroundings in the night, that will not reveal itself until morning, by which time the Caliph will have completed his passage from power to memory. Al-Amin and Al-Mamun receive their respective portions of the empire, the division already breeding conflict, and you are present at the ceremony of designation that preceded this final journey, the documents prepared and witnessed in the very chambers where the Barmakid's destruction was authorized. Al-Amin, born in 787, ruled as 6th Abbasid Caliph from 809 to 813 before his death in the conflict, and his younger brother Al-Mamun, born September 14, 786, emerged victorious after 4 years of war, ruling from 813 to 833, the dates and names repeating in the historical record with the mechanical inevitability of their fulfillment. The silence between brothers who have become enemies, preserved in diplomatic letters read aloud, begins as a literal silence in the ceremonial space, the two sons standing at prescribed distances from their father, from each other, from the witnesses whose presence validates what the documents declare. You observe the particular quality of light in that chamber, the filtered illumination through clerestory windows that leaves the lower spaces in relative shadow, the faces of the participants emerging and submerging as clouds pass overhead, the symbolism of this lighting perhaps noted by contemporaries, perhaps merely accepted as atmospheric fact. The Caliph's voice, when he speaks the terms of division, carries the hoarseness of recent illness, the Khorasanian campaign already present in his body as premonition, and the words themselves, Al-Amin and Al-Mamun, repeat with each mention of their respective territories, the repetition that confirms becoming the repetition that divides. The hollow sound of a city recovering from siege, fewer voices in the markets, gaps in the crowds, belongs to the years after 813, after Al-Mamun's victory, but you perceive its anticipation in the very ceremony of division, the spaces between the assembled witnesses already suggestive of absence. The civil war between Al-Amin and Al-Mamun damaged Baghdad and diverted resources from cultural patronage, and the cultural peak associated with Al-Mamun emerged partly from reaction against the violence of the succession struggle, a paradox of destruction and creation that you trace in the altered acoustics of the ceremonial chamber as the participants disperse. Their footsteps echo with a hollowness that precedes the actual hollowness of siege, the architecture itself seeming to amplify rather than absorb the sounds of human departure, and the particular cold of the palace's interior spaces reasserts itself as the body heat of the assembly dissipates, the stone walls releasing their stored chill into the diminishing occupation. You remain in the chamber after the others have gone, the documents still spread on the low table where they were signed, the ink now drying to a brown less absolute than its initial black, the words becoming historical record through this chemical transformation, this oxidation that continues without human attention. Al-Mamun spent the early part of his reign in Khorasan, only entering Baghdad in 819, and you are standing in the procession that makes this delayed entry, the 10th year after the father's death at Tus, the 6th year after the brother's death in the conflict that the father's division had made probable if not inevitable. The road from the eastern gate has been cleared and sprinkled with water, the dust suppressed for the occasion of return, and the particular quality of light in the early morning, the long shadows of riders and horses stretching across the dampened surface, creates a visual rhythm of arrival that the crowd observes in relative silence. The hollow sound of a city recovering from siege persists, despite the ceremonial occasion. The population still diminished from its pre-war numbers, the physical damage to walls and buildings still visible in the gaps between newer constructions that have not yet achieved the patina of continuous occupation. Incense burned to cover the smell of recent violence in a reopened palace drifts across the procession's path, the agar wood and camphor mingling with the damp earth, and the residual smoke of cooking fires from the neighborhoods that line the route, the olfactory complexity of a city attempting to resume its previous identity through deliberate sensory overlay. You are walking among the soldiers whose loyalty has been secured through the years of conflict, their armor catching the morning light in rhythmic flashes that mark the procession's pace, their boots on the prepared road producing a sound more muffled than martial, the dampening effect of the sprinkled water transforming military display into something closer to liturgical procession. The Mihna, or Inquisition testing, officials' belief in the createdness of the Quran, marked a harder religious line under Al-Mamun, and this harder line belongs to the later years of the reign that began with this entry in 819, a decade after the father's death, but its anticipation exists in the very theatricality of the procession's religious framing. The scholars and jurists who walk near the Caliph's person, displaying their adherence to doctrines that will later be tested and enforced. You observe the particular quality of their garments, the black and white of Abbasid official dress, now supplemented with the green of prophetic descent, the color symbolism already dense with political implication, the visual vocabulary of legitimacy being rewritten even as it is displayed. The silence between brothers who have become enemies has been succeeded by the silence of a victor regarding the violence of his victory, the documents of Al-Amin's final months now archived and inaccessible, the interpretation of conflict becoming the prerogative of the survivor. The air carries the warmth of the advancing day, the morning's long shadows contracting toward noon, and the particular heat of Baghdad in the months before summer, that anticipatory warmth that contains within it the promise of intensification, surrounds the procession as it approaches the palace gates. The cultural peak associated with Al-Mamun emerged partly from reaction against the violence of the succession struggle, and you perceive this emergence in the very architecture of the palace that receives him, the reconstructed chambers bearing traces of their destruction and renewal, the new materials adjacent to the old in patterns that record the city's recent history in physical form. The silence between brothers, finds its echo in the silence of these spaces regarding the conflict that shaped them, the reconstruction effacing as it restores, the new stone covering the marks of siege without fully eliminating their memory. You are standing in a courtyard where workmen continue their finishing tasks, the sound of chisels against limestone intermittent beneath the ceremonial music that has begun to play from an upper gallery, the two acoustic registers, labor and celebration, coexisting without reconciliation. The particular cold of a palace prison, underground, where no sun reaches, persists in the foundations beneath this reconstructed magnificence. The cells where political opponents awaited their fates still present, though no longer visible, the architectural palimpsest of powers exercise and powers display contained in the vertical dimension of the structure itself. The Barmakid family's power ended suddenly in 8-3, 17 years after Harun's accession, and the specific reasons for their fall remain historically unclear, variously attributed to fiscal disputes, personal conflict, or dynastic politics. The idea that the violence of their fall persists in institutional memory as a warning about power's intimacy with power is a dramatic interpretation rather than established historical consensus. You are walking through the library that will be established in the years following this entry, the space not yet constructed, but already anticipated in the Caliph's known inclinations, the collection of manuscripts from Greek and Persian and Sanskrit sources that would constitute a form of imperial extension through cultural appropriation. The particular scent of parchment and ink, the dry, organic smell of preserved knowledge, mingles in your imagination with the actual smells of the procession's aftermath, the sweat of horses and men, the incense still drifting from the palace entrance, the cooking smoke from the surrounding neighborhoods. Al-Mamun, traditionally said to be born on September 14, 786, emerged victorious after a civil war that lasted roughly 4 years, ruling from 813 to 833, and the dates of this reign, like the dates of the Barmakid fall and his father's death, appear repeatedly in historical sources with the weight of established fact. The repetition that confirms becoming the repetition that commemorates, the very mechanism of memory operating through this return to named moments. The hollow sound of a city recovering from siege gradually fills across the years of this reign, the population returning, the physical damage repaired, the acoustic texture of urban life restoring its previous density, though never exactly its previous character. You are standing in a market street some years after the entry of 819, the decade after the father's death having passed into the second decade, the Caliph's presence in Baghdad, now established as continuous, though his attention would increasingly turn eastward again in the final years. The particular quality of light in this street, filtered through the canvas awnings that merchants have stretched between upper windows, creates a dappled illumination that falls across the goods displayed on low tables and hanging cords, the textiles and ceramics and prepared foods arranged in patterns that suggest abundance, recovered rather than abundance uninterrupted. The metallic taste of fear has become, for this generation, a memory rather than a present sensation. The violence of the succession struggle belonging to narratives rather than to immediate experience, though the narratives themselves circulate with sufficient frequency to maintain the knowledge of what had been possible, what remains possible. The air moves through the street with the particular freshness of morning in Baghdad, before the heat of midday has accumulated, before the dust has risen from the traffic of later hours, and the voices of the market, the bargaining and greeting and occasional dispute, constitute a social acoustics that the siege had interrupted and that the recovery has gradually restored. You are walking toward the palace as the morning advances, the market street giving way to broader thoroughfares, the density of commercial display thinning into the spaciousness of administrative approach. The transition itself, a spatial enactment of the social hierarchy that the caliphate maintains. You pass between these guards without challenge, your presence assumed by the familiarity of your movement through these spaces, and the particular quality of interior light, filtered through pierced stone screens, creates patterns on the floor that shift with the sun's movement, the temporal dimension made visible in the slow migration of illuminated geometries across the polished surface. You are standing in a chamber where documents are stored, the accumulated records of the caliphate's administration, the letters and accounts and orders that constitute the written trace of powers exercised across the decades since Harun's accession in 786, the years accumulating in these scrolls and codices with the physical weight of preserved time. The particular scent of aged parchment, the slightly sweet decomposition of organic materials in controlled conditions, fills the space with an atmosphere of preservation that contrasts with the transience of the events preserved, the violence and reconciliation and renewed violence that these documents record in scripts that remain legible though their authors have long since passed. You are running your fingers across the labels that identify these stored documents, the tactile encounter with history's material substrate, the raised ink of certain scripts creating a topography that the fingertips can read independently of visual recognition. The metallic taste of fear returns as a phantom sensation as you handle these papers, the documents themselves bearing no visible trace of the violence that would follow their composition, the ordinary administrative language continuing its formulae through the very months when the fall was being prepared, the disjunction between content and consequence producing a vertigo of historical understanding. You are ascending now, returning to the palace's inhabited levels, the temperature rising with your elevation, the filtered light becoming more insistent as you approach the screens that separate storage from reception. The particular quality of this light, its diffusion through stone perforations, creates an atmosphere of gentle illumination that seems to belong to a different order of experience than the violence that these walls have witnessed, the executions and imprisonments and political calculations that constitute the other history of this space.